Hello and good morning. This is Coffee Talk on Things and Stuff for Friday, April 17th of 2020, where we are still under quarantine lockdown as our nation is dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and trying to flatten the curve. This is our Friday show where we kind of take a more lighthearted look at things that have gone on in the world of Mormonism and ex-Mormonism. The the topic for today is a YouTube video of a debate that has been going around the social media, a debate between a Christian defender and Kwaku L, who is a young comedian YouTube personality that has really carved out a niche for himself in making faith promoting videos and humorous and entertaining videos on the subject of Mormonism. And I think he engages his audience on a level that is much more relatable to kind of the millennial and younger crowd, because he takes things a little bit more lighthearted, and that kind of makes him hard to engage on a religious debate sort of level for a lot of the staunch ex-Mormon critics, because they want to talk seriously about things, and Kwaku has just a really great way of making things lighthearted and almost kind of pointing out the generational gap between the two different sides in a way that's it really prevents you from doing any gotchas or anything like that. But what we get to see in this video is kind of an example of how this debate is entered into and what it is that leads to the result of the debate, which is, spoiler alert, that Kwaku ends up drawing a boundary for himself and deciding that the discussion was not going to be fair to him, and the discussion was not going to have any positive results from his perspective. And so without any apology, without any explanation, he just leaves. And so the question that we have, I think people are spreading this video around the internet saying, oh, look, Kwaku just left. You know, he gave up. He's a coward. He's a chicken or whatever. But if you watch the video, there's some big problems with how his debate, opponents, and the whole debate itself, with how it was moderated, with how he was treated, with how the subject was treated. And I think there's a lot to learn just from the perspective of people who discuss some of these issues, some of these critical issues with faithful members. How do you go about doing it in a way that fosters actual discussion rather than an adversarial conflict? And so I think that's what's useful in looking at this. What we're going to do is I've posted a link in the discussion for this video if you want to see what the source is. Let me see if I can pull up our actual thing here. Okay, add it to the stream. Here we go. So this is the Gospel Truth. I guess that's a YouTube channel. I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen here. And it starts out, they set up the debate as a discussion. They frame it as a discussion, which when you try to frame and you invite somebody to come and have a discussion on your podcast or on your group, especially when you know that the opinions and the perspectives are absolutely, contradictory. There's no way to really reconcile the two perspectives that are brought here. Kwaku's perspective about Mormonism and the restored gospel, and this gentleman's perspective. There's no way to really bring them into harmony. They're contradictory. So framing it as a discussion is a much more healthy approach, because it takes out the idea, I think, that you're going to have a winner and a loser. Now, in reality, I think everyone knows that when you enter a discussion and you try to bring your best arguments, you hope that there's going to be a winner or loser in the minds of the people who listen to the debate, because everybody who listens to a debate is going to come up in their own mind with who made the most sound arguments, who made the better case that was free of distorting bias and did not have to resort to any cognitive distortions in order to come to the conclusion that they had, and who better addressed and responded to the criticisms of the other side. I think depending on how you perform in a debate, your audience is going to have a sense of who won in that debate on technical grounds. And that may be different from what somebody believes that is the truth and the reality of the issue at all. You can have somebody who is very cordial, who does not resort to fallacies or ad hominem, who engages in a debate and does so in a very respectful way, and yet at the end you still don't agree with their position. And that's okay. And that's how you would respectfully engage in those things. But framing it as a debate means that we're going to declare in the midst of the debate, or we'll have a moderator who kind of declares a winner, or we'll appeal to the audience to declare a winner. And that's really just a more adversarial approach to this type of thing. What they did, and you can see in their thumbnail for it, is they just framed it as a discussion. Now, a discussion is, I think, conceptually different, and I think it's a more preferable way to engage in these types of exchanges. And that is where ideally what you're doing is you're hoping both sides will lay out their argument and try to make a convincing and compelling case for their perspective, and they will try to increase the understanding of their opponent or their interlocutor, so that both sides at the end of the discussion come away with a more clear, more complete and comprehensive understanding of the other side of the debate, or the other side of the perspective. That would be a success. And again, it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with either side, but if you have a better understanding of it, then that's helpful. When I listen to a podcast or read a book or watch a documentary about Heaven's Gate or Jehovah's Witnesses or anything like that, even though I don't agree with them, if I come away feeling like I have a better understanding of their theology, their belief, their culture, then that helps me kind of understand, when I hear stories about them, why people would make certain decisions, why they would do certain things. And so I think that's the better way to frame it. So they framed it as a discussion. Did it actually end up being that? I don't think so. I think it ended up being more of a debate, and a pretty controversial and contested one. So let's see if we can get this working here. Oh, hold on. I think I may have it set. No, it's set to normal. Okay. Let's see. All right. So we have our moderator, who is the owner of the channel, I believe. I'm still in full screen. Am I in full screen? I'm having some technical times here. Okay, so.
Can you believe it? My man's busy, man. I guess he's busy man. But he hit me up a month later and said, yeah, he'll do it. So he came on, I hooked him up, Mr. Sam Shimon, and they here today.
Okay, so I fixed some of the technical things here. So Sam Shimon is the person that this channel chose to go up against Kwaku L. I'm not familiar with Sam, but I've been told that he has a bit of a reputation for being a little bit on the fringes of Christian debaters. He apparently engages Islam and Christianity versus the Muslim perspective in most of his debates. And that's revealed kind of in his opening statement, where he immediately makes the comparison between Joseph Smith and Muhammad. And he then goes on to engage in the debate with a particular style that we'll see a little bit of. But what I want to do is fast forward a little bit past the introduction. He sets the moderator here sets up the debate, says that he's going to not really give much of his own input into it, but then he'll step in if people start resorting to ad hominem or insulting each other or things like that. And then he invites Kwaku to give his opening statement and talk a little bit about, I guess, an introduction to him. I'm wrestling with Yu-Gi-Oh here a little bit, and so you'll have to forgive me on that. Okay, why does this keep scrolling? It's really, really annoying. Let me see if I can fix that. Smart scroll. Fine. I just want to turn this hover scroll off. Vector scroll off. The whole thing off. Okay, sorry about that. I'm having issue that I think I just overcame. So let's see.
Fellas in and let these guys introduce themselves. What is going on, fellas? How y'all doing?
Super good.
Good, good.
All right.
Hey Sam,
Yeah,
I saw you bobbing your head to the beat, man. The beat was dope, huh?
I hear that. See what your man got to do with me now. That's pre-Christian days, brother. Pre-Christian days.
I hear you, man. Good stuff, good
We
stuff.
fake now, sanctified. We don't do that.
Thank you both for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth, man. You know, with this whole quarantine thing going on, man, we taking this time out to go ahead and jump on here.
Okay, let's see if we can fast forward.
My audience is, I believe that we're.
So we'll see how this discussion goes.
Okay.
Trusting the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so he introduces the two, and I want to just jump to Kwaku's introduction. Already you can tell there's a big difference in our debate people here. Kwaku is young, and he has a very engaging sort of way of approaching things, and he speaks very confidently, whatever argument he's making. And when you enter into a discussion with someone, I think one of the signs that you can project as a person engaging in the discussion is your confidence in your position, but also your humility as a human. And so this is something that I think people will perceive as a weakness, but actually is a strength in a debate where you want to be persuasive. And that is that if you don't know something, it's okay for you to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to go and take some time to investigate it. And this is one of the points that we'll see later. Kwaku tries to get the other person to concede on, and the guy won't do it. He won't admit that he doesn't know something. It actually makes him weaker, because when you engage in these discussions, if you're willing to say that you don't know something or that you're not totally confident about something, that's an opportunity for the other side to give you their perspective, which gives you something then to respond to, because what they then tell you gives you an idea of what things that they're holding on to, and then you can address those particular things. But let's hear Kwaku introduce himself. Let's see here.
Holy Spirit, anoint me for the glory of Jesus.
All right, all right. All right, next up, Kwaku, man. Go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself.
Yes, so my name is Kwaku. I am a Latter-day Saint YouTuber. So my channel is just called Kwaku. You just type in Kwaku and it appears. I preach the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe that we're in some very interesting times, and we're trying to prepare the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so we want everyone out there to know about the truth, to know about the restored gospel, to know who Jesus Christ is, to know why you're here, where you came from, and where you're going, and who you can trust in. And so that's my goal in line. I use a lot of...
Okay, so Kwaku's done a great job of kind of outlining some key Mormon points here. And the other person is coming from a very kind of evangelical biblical perspective, where the Bible is considered the ultimate and highest authority that you appeal to. And so the way that his opponent is going to make arguments is saying, I can disprove something you're saying because I can point to a verse in the Bible which contradicts the thing that you're saying. And if anyone's ever engaged in this type of discussion, then you'll know that there almost has to be cherry picking on that side of the argument, because just as much as you can find one verse in the Bible that may support one thing, you can find another verse that could either support or be interpreted to support something else. And so there is so much leeway given in the motives and the mind and the interpretation of the person reading the Bible that you're going to find people arguing using the Bible as an authority for many different perspectives that seem to contradict itself. Now, this reality is something that Joseph Smith himself capitalized on in the formation of the church. He was able to see that people read and interpreted different passages in the Bible and came to different conclusions, and then based a faith framework on those different conclusions. He was able to take that apparently confusing position and say, well, I will solve that by declaring myself to be an authority with divinely appointed authority to give an authoritative interpretation. This is the real interpretation. You know, these other religionists are just asking you to accept their human interpretation of the Bible and go with it. Well, I'm telling you, what I'm giving you is a divine pronouncement of what the scripture means, what the gospel is, and how you can achieve your salvation in an authoritative and restored form. So That key, that authoritative element of what Joseph Smith did, solved the problem in the minds of people who accepted him at his word, because they didn't have to try to guess which pastor had the right interpretation. They had somebody telling them that God told them this was the right way. And to some extent, that's the same dilemma that's happening here. And that is that you have an evangelical Christian who is speaking from a particular interpretation of the Bible and using the Bible as his key to authority. And we have somebody who is following the pattern of Joseph Smith, saying, you need to know who you can trust. He talks about that we're living in interesting times, and that's, it's not too veiled language to indicate that you can interpret things like a worldwide pandemic, like earthquakes happening in Utah, like economic calamity. You could interpret those things to be a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And he can point to prophecy in Revelations. He could also point to statements that Joseph Smith made in a prophetic mode that seem to indicate that at some point in the future, the great nation of America will have its own political and economic calamities. And so those things can be seen as further support of the authoritative and divinely appointed role of Joseph Smith as a prophet. And that is an appeal Kwaku is going to make consistently in his argument. And it's the right appeal for Mormons to make, because that is the power of the Mormon position, is that you don't have to rely on men interpreting out of their own judgment what Scripture means. We have a prophet who is going to tell you, not on his opinion, but on the authority of God, thus saith the Lord type of assurances. You'll know that what we're saying is true. Now, this will create a problem for Kwaku when he goes to try to answer inconsistencies in things that Joseph said, because Kwaku has to resort to well, that was just Joseph Smith's opinion. And that problem is going to trip people up who really think and dig into the history of the church, because when it becomes impossible to determine at the time statements are made by prophets, when it becomes impossible to determine what is opinion and what is the voice of God and the authoritative pronouncement from God, and that distinction can only be made decades, years later, once something has changed, which is a total inconsistency, then you have to say, well, okay, that thing was just his opinion. And so that's a big problem for a lot of people in the church that have left the church. And we'll see how he engages that in the context of this discussion. Now, one thing about this whole phenomenon, where Kwaku, as a defender of the church, is going and engaging in debate and discussion with people who take a evangelical Christian perspective, is that he is debating and arguing with people who already have kind of handed him the trophy. And what I mean by that is that when Joseph Smith formulated the gospel, and it's been evolved and refined over the years, it was done so in a way that built upon a Christian foundation and Christian ideas. And Joseph Smith solved a lot of the dilemma and the quandary that they have by declaring an authoritative interpretation and then placing his prophetic seal on it, saying that this was something that came from God with the authority of a prophet. The problem is that if somebody is going to refute Joseph Smith's claim in that regard, then they're going to have to use tools of logic and reason in order to do so. And if they would use the same tools of logic and reason that would append Joseph Smith's position, then a Mormon trying to defend Joseph Smith will say, okay, if you're going to debunk Joseph Smith using those conclusions, those logical tools, then you also have to debunk the Bible. You also have to debunk the prophets in the Old and New Testament. You have to debunk your beliefs in Christianity as well. And because people arguing this from a Christian perspective don't want to abandon Christianity, then they kind of already have an arm tied behind their back, because they have to be able to formulate their arguments and make their case in a way that allows them to toss Joseph Smith aside, but still hold on to evangelical Christianity. Now, you can make the distinction between evangelical Christianity and a Christianity which uses a kind of an infallible, inerrant notion of the Bible from which they draw their principles and ideas from. And that's very different from somebody who is still considers themselves to be Christian, but is able to identify and discard harmful, incorrect, invalid, or wrong ideas, even from Scripture. Those are two very different things. What you won't see, or at least we haven't seen to date, is Kwaku being willing to engage someone in this type of format, a live debate format, who himself is ex-Mormon or has a working familiarity with the problems of the history of the church and can engage on that level. That being said, there's not many people, even on Kwaku's side of this thing, who are willing to even engage evangelical Christians in this sort of live debate format. So it does take some cojones for him to do that, and it's always good to see that he's willing to put himself out there like that. And these Christian YouTubers, they want views, they want, people to talk about their channels, and so they want to have something controversial. So for them to invite Kwaku is not surprising because he's somebody who's willing to talk. But for Kwaku to accept the invitation and show up actually is a little bit of an extension of grace on Kwaku's part, because he knows that these things can get contentious, but he's still willing to enter into the discussion and debate. And so he really is their guest there. And it's incumbent upon them to be cordial and polite and make sure that the discussion is one that actually is going to further the cause of understanding. So let's continue here.
There's a lot of humor when I do it too. My audience is mostly college students and high schoolers, but it seems to be expanding in demographics every day. So yeah, that's what I'm here, trying to preach the truth, let everyone know about the restored gospel and the doctrines contained in the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. And today testifying that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God and was chosen by Jesus Christ literally to be his servant and an apostle of him in these last days.
All right. Thank you both once again for joining me on this episode.
Question?
What's up, Sam?
I want to know, because I'm just meeting this man for the first time. Why?
Okay. So Kwaku kind of lays out his argument pretty good. He lays out the position, just kind of the foundational ideas of the church, where it's different because they have living apostles. They can listen to God and receive new scripture. And let's see here. I don't know. I don't really care about his opponent all that much, except when it gets to the actual debate itself. So he spends some time here saying, well, why is your last name L? That can be an interesting question for somebody familiar with ancient religions, because El was the name of one of the early gods that was transformed into Elohim, which then, if you study the history of God, that goes down a whole pathway leading to the Judeo-Christian ideas that we have today. But that just is his last name, Kwaku El. It doesn't have anything to do with religion or God or anything like that.
Out there, give a quick opening statement, and then we're going to have about a 60-minute discussion between you two. I will not interject unless I hear some ad hominems thrown around, or I hear the conversation is veering off target. Other than that, you won't worry about me jumping in. After that, we have about a 5-10 minute closing remarks, and then we have Q&A from the audience. Is that good?
Sure.
Yes, good.
All right, Mr. Kwaku, if you don't mind going ahead and giving a quick opening statement of your position, man.
Right. So there is an urgency in the current cultural battle among Westerners. We are losing our religious identity. College campuses across America are increasingly secular and atheistic. Our mainstream media pushes an atheistic agenda in music and in film. We're in a battle of ideology and morality. My generation, Generation Z, increasingly feels that mainstream Christianity is unable to answer the tough questions. My generation overwhelmingly feels as if religious statements and philosophical debate fall flat. As mainstream Christianity strengthens its academia, it loses its people.
Okay, so I want to validate what Kwaku is his opening salvo in his opening statement, and that is that people are becoming disillusioned with religion. And I think he's setting this up as a juxtaposition between conventional Christianity and Mormonism is going to be the solution that people are looking for. But what he may be missing the boat on is that the same criticisms, the same disenchantment, disillusionism that people are having with regards to religion in general is also being applied to Mormonism in specific. And this is something that is understandable from his perspective because he's defending the church. But if you're not addressing the criticisms that people have with mainstream Christianity and religion in general on the subject of Mormonism itself, then you're missing the boat. You're not actually addressing the things that are causing people to have the problem that he's opening with. He mentioned that his audience is mostly young and that it's college campuses where a lot of this disillusionment is felt. And it just needs to be pointed out that college campuses are where you have a large population of people on the cusp of adulthood. These are people who have just graduated high school. They are leaving the shelter of their parents' home. They are no longer in the 24/7 shelter of the tradition of their parents. And they're in a point in their life where they're trying to discover who they are. And very naturally, part of that discovery is branching out and doing things that are by definition not what your parents did, because that's one of the ways psychologically and mentally that we differentiate ourselves from our parents. This is why the notion of the rebellious teenager and the years of your youthful indiscretion, a lot of that is specifically doing things that are different from what your parents do, and that's just part of how you, as you develop, make sure that you're not your parents. That reality, that psychological and human developmental reality, is something that groups that try to indoctrinate vulnerable people have capitalized on for decades. This is why when you go back and you look at the periods where Moonies and Scientologists and all of these groups that we hear the word cult tossed around about, when you look at where they focused a lot of their proselytizing efforts, a lot of it was on college campuses. When you study groups like the group that even Charles Manson started, and there are a number of other hippie counterculture groups that started in California kind of in the 1960s. A lot of that was appealing to people at this age. They may not have been on college campuses, but they were in other contexts defined by a search for meaning, a search for purpose. They were able to take people who were in that vulnerable state of mind where they were trying to redefine themselves and look for purpose and meaning, and they gave them a purpose, and that purpose was tied to belonging in the group, and it invariably included obedience to an authoritative religious figure or spiritual guru or something like that. And so the fact that Kwaku's framing all of this about, on college campuses, and he himself is a college student, is just reflective of that same sort of symptom where these groups are targeting vulnerable populations for their message. You're looking for meaning, you're looking for your identity. Well, if you join our group, you'll find great meaning, you'll find great identity, you'll find a purpose defined by salvation, and we provide you the knowledge of every step that you need on the way to get that salvation. Now, that doesn't mean that Mormons are the only ones that do that. That there are evangelical Christian groups which use the same methods of thought reform, of undue influence, in order to compel their members to obey their particular leader. And it's not a form of spiritual autonomy, it's a form of spiritual dependence on whoever in that group declares to be the authority. That doesn't mean that all of them are like that, but those groups do exist, and there are red flags to them. But let's continue with our discussion here.
Whether the subject is about the suffering of man, the fallibility of Scripture, or the specificity of heaven, mainstream Christianity seems to offer general, vague, emotional statements that lack any exhaustive answers that stand up to muster. And with all sensitivity and...
Okay, so I want to address that particular point because this is something that Mormonism really, really prides itself on, and it prides itself on certainty and answers. And, if you have a question about the metaphysical world, your purpose, what to expect in the hereafter, where we came from, why the earth even exists, Mormonism hands you an answer that all you have to do is accept. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about the implications of it. And you don't have to deal with the uncertainty that people who don't accept those answers have to deal with. And from one perspective, particularly when you're trying to differentiate yourself from your parents and you're trying to find your identity and meaning in life, it's very appealing to have those answers handed to you, because you don't really have to then worry. You don't have to deal with uncertainty, and you don't have to come to terms with mortality. And there's all different things that are comforting by somebody handing you certainty. And this is really reflected in what happens when people who grew up with that certainty handed to them without question. If you grew up in the church and the prophets had already told you what your purpose, meaning, and role in life was, well, then once you discover and leave the church, you have to now wrestle with those great questions. Now, people who grow up outside of a religious framework that hands them that degree of certainty have to deal with this as they mature, as they grow in the normal context of their life. So while they're going to college, while they're transitioning to adulthood, they're also wrestling with these questions. And many times that wrestle involves coming to terms and accepting uncertainty. And there's really something very liberating about uncertainty, because what it gives you is it gives you the freedom to determine certain things for yourself, to figure them out for yourself, and to consider those answers to be just as valid as the thought and the consideration and the values that you brought to their conclusions, which then allows you to change and to grow and to adapt as you change and grow and adapt as a human throughout the course of your life. That is a very appealing perspective, because it allows you to learn, it allows you to grow, it allows you to be somebody different in the future from where you are now, because all of your answers are something that you yourself have shaped out of the cloud of uncertainty that exists in the world around us. Now compare that to somebody who lives in a very rigid, structured, ordered religious framework, where all of those answers and those purposes are handed to you by divine decree through the mouth of a prophet, so that you don't have to work through those things. You simply accept them. Now, that can be helpful in terms of feeling like you know what is right and what is wrong. But then when you live your life and you're confronted with some of the challenges of existence, what is right and wrong on this particular issue that is never mentioned or referenced in Scripture, this political situation that we're facing as a nation, how do I know what is right and wrong? Well, if your entire moral framework and worldview is something that you have accepted because it was handed to you by a religious authority, then your only answer in those contexts can really be, well, let's look at what the brethren say. Let's look at what dear leader has said about this issue. And it may be that the brethren or leader hasn't said anything specific about that issue. And in those instances, you may step out on your own and try to come up with your own idea. But at any point, if the leader comes out and solidifies a position one way or the other, then you will immediately discard whatever your own judgment was and adopt the judgment of the brethren. And, we've seen this recently in the Mormon Church with how they dealt with LGBT families, where a child of gay parents who had been married may still want the fellowship of their friends and participation in the church. And bishops and church members were, because nothing had been said about that, they were willing to go ahead and extend baptism and fellowship and advancement in the church to those people, because that question specifically had been not answered by the brethren. And then in November of 2015, the brethren solidified a position, and they said that those individuals are not to be given baptism, advancement in the church. And then they provided some reasons why they felt like this would be better for them in the long run. And suddenly that's what everybody accepted. Some people were like, well, I don't know about that. But ultimately, in order to say that they sustained the brethren and they sustained the prophet, they had to accept it as God's reality in the church. And this was the position that they held for a couple of years, until a few years later, the brethren then came out with a new position, which took the old one and added to it in a way that allowed people to adopt the perspective that they had before. But just the fact that people married to a worldview that was handed to them, which included deference to the authority of the brethren of the church who claim to speak for God, means that when they were confronted with this moral dilemma, even if they had previously come to some personal conclusion, they had to immediately throw that away and adopt the principle and ideas coming from the prophet as their own. And so that just tells you the nature of an individual's moral framework. When you compare somebody who's dealing with uncertainty and therefore having to come to determination on their own judgment and therefore are more amenable to changing and adapting a position versus somebody whose only real moral principle is obedience to the brethren, because that's been handed to them. All right, so let's continue.
And respect to those who do adhere to mainstream Christianity, the reality is those answers are lacking and people are fleeing because mainstream Christianity is not true. Mainstream Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Roman paganism, Celtic spiritualism, Egyptian theology, and ancient Sumerian religions all have one thing in common. They are ancient beliefs, rooted in divine manifestations to the people of earth. Note the word ancient. Not one of them has a significant modern witness. To many people, the miraculous God of Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, is silent today and ceases to work miracles. It is the same with the mainstream Christian reinvention of Yahweh. He was heavily involved in the affairs of man in both the Old and New Testament, speaking with prophets, sending angels, and more. Mainstream Christianity, through the mouths of pastors, priests, ministers, and reverends, have effectively preached against modern miracles, alluded away from them, or have been unclear about whether they should come or not. Yet, in the spring of 1820, a world-changing event occurred. A young farm boy named Joseph Smith Jr. was appeared to in a grove of trees by God the Father and Jesus Christ and numerous angels. This divine counsel of prophetic selection, often seen in the Bible, occurred once again, ushering in the last dispensation.
Okay, well, I think it's worth addressing some of his points here. He does do the discourteous thing of basically slapping his interlocutor in the face and saying that Christianity is not true, which is, I think then when his opponent goes on to say that Mormonism is a cult or Mormonism is, a false prophet, it's a little bit of a tit for tat because he started out in his opening salvo by saying that Christianity is not true. I think there are a lot of even faithful Mormon leaders who wouldn't say Christianity is not true. We have the famous statement from Gordon B. Hinckley that, we see truth and goodness in people all around us, and we invite members of other faiths to come and join us and add their truth to ours, add their goodness to ours, and make us both better. And that's a much more ecumenical, a much more I think, cordial approach to this type of discussion. And to be clear, it is very different from the approach that Joseph Smith first made. If you go and you read the most widely distributed version of the first vision, Joseph Smith places the word in the mouth of God or Christ that all the other religions are false and their professors are corrupt, and that even though they draw near to them with their lips or they give good lip service, they may use the name of God a lot. In truth, they're actually far from Christ. And so he's really adopting the early Joseph Smith mode of engaging the wider Christian world in a very dismissive and confrontational way that I think the church itself has grown beyond. It really is more interested in developing ties and connections with other mainstream faiths of the world in a way that will both increase its own standing in the world as well as present a united front for what it sees as erosion of freedom of religion in some of the world, in the United States and particularly in Europe, which has become much more secular. And so by uniting with other faiths, they're able to make a much stronger argument for freedom of religion. And Honder is correcting my pronunciation. That's okay. I'm all right with that correction. I mispronounce things all the time. Okay, but one of the things he said is that all of those other religions are ancient, and he brings up, an ancient religion of Zoroastrianism, and then says that, most people think that the God of Zoroastrianism is, has been silent. Well, that may be true, but what if some guy said, I'm speaking for the God of Zoroastrianism now, I'm the new Zoroastrian prophet. That was the first religion that really engaged in the religious fight between good and evil being a central element of religion, so I'm going to adopt that now. Well, just because you have some ancient religion, having a modern person claiming to speak for that ancient God does not prove that this person does actually speak for God. And that's the quandary that the wider Christian world has with Joseph Smith. But even that being said, if you just go and Google Theophany Mine, Theophne Mine, then one of the first hits is going to be an article called Theophany Mine, 16 Precedents to the First Vision. And let me see if I can bring that up here. And I will hit share screen and Chrome tab, and we'll bring that up. All right. So in this page, it's 16 precedents to Joseph Smith's first vision. It's an article on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website. You can see that it starts out with just a summary of the first vision, and then it gives you 16 different accounts, starting from 1786 going all the way up to 1838 and 1841, of different individuals who wrote down their own experiences being visited by God, receiving a special call to religious work by God, having their sins forgiven, feeling like before they were visited by God, they felt the adversary around them and steps coming up to them, even God appearing above in a pillar of light. There's all different elements of what we accept as Joseph Smith's theophany or his visitation by God, but happening to people not connected to Mormonism, some people even connected to Mormonism, throughout. And I'll encourage you to go and check out that article. You can click on every single account. Will have a reference that you can go through and visit and see in the actual book, which would have been published and available in Joseph Smith's time. Where those accounts are, you can read their context and you can see everything that you need to see about them. So the bottom line is, while we in the modern age may see this type of man being visited by God experience as something very, very unique, something that must have been unprecedented for Joseph to go out and claim that, it was a common mode that people had to being called into religious service and religious work. At that time, there was a pattern of getting your call into the ministry or deciding that you wanted to devote your life to being involved in religion, that was having this type of experience. I was able to find 16. I think other people have been able to find a larger number than that, but I wanted to confine my search to instances where I could actually link you to a book that would have been already published or a story that would have already been known at the time that Joseph Smith came out with his. And that brings up the other issue that people will have with the first vision experiences, that even though it is supposed to have occurred in a particular time in the 1820s, it wasn't actually talked about or even heard of or used in any missionary discussions or anything until at least 11 years after that is when we see the first written account of it. And it was even years beyond that before it was ever something that was a part of the story of the origin of the church. And keep in mind, the story of the origin of the church, how the church came to be, why it is, that was something central to the minds of early saints, and it was part of the motivation for Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith to write the first history of the church. And when they wrote that first history of the church, one of the most powerful and effective things could have been to relate the visitation of Joseph Smith as a young boy by God the Father and God the Son. However, it was not included in the earliest form of the history of the church. Now, critics say that this is because Joseph Smith had not yet come up with that part of the story, and that he later, when he saw the power that this type of visitation would have in increasing his claim to be a divinely called prophet, particularly when he saw the type of response that some other people got when they had this claim. I think there was a young boy who actually was Mormon who had claimed to be visited by God the Father and God the Son. Well, then he created a story and then retro-dated it so that, oh yeah, this happened 12 years ago, and now it's part of the narrative. So I think critics see that as being why it's not spoken of, whereas defenders of Joseph will say, well, it was such a sacred experience that he couldn't talk about it until people around him were prepared to receive it. And that's a hard thing to accept when you see him having God tell him very banal things about building the hotel, and it's very self-serving things about the church members having to support him so he didn't have to work, so he could translate the New Testament and the Old Testament. All of those things were, I guess, they weren't as sacred as the first experience, and so they could be shared, whereas the other one couldn't be shared. It doesn't make logical sense, and that's part of why people reject Joseph's claim to be a prophet. So let's keep going.
Dispensation to prepare the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Joseph learned that Christ's New Testament church was lost from the earth and that a great apostasy had occurred. God the Father and Jesus Christ were restoring the ancient order in the authoritative church on the earth. Not a reformation, but a restoration. After this, Joseph was appeared to by an angel named Moroni who lived on this continent long ago, and he was instructed to retrieve an ancient record on gold plates and translate them using the Urim and Thummim by the gift and power of God. 3 witnesses saw these golden plates, physically held them in their hands, and saw the angel with their literal eyes. 8 more witnesses saw and held the plates. The restoration of the gospel began with 1 witness of the divine and continued with many. This gives.
Okay, so Kwaku is making some very definitive statements about certain aspects of church history, and he's making these statements as though they are exactly as he represents them to be, and there's no reason that anyone would question it. And if you tried to question or contradict some of the things that he's saying, then then there's a problem that we would have to work through. And so I think some of the things that are contradictory would include the accounts of the witnesses. He makes a point of saying that the witnesses saw them with their literal eyes, and you can go back and you can cherry pick remembrances and statements from those witnesses and say that's true. The witnesses saw them with their literal eyes. And if those were the only statements that were made, then that would be fine. The difficulty comes that the statements, those witnesses also made statements indicating that they saw them with their spiritual eyes, or that it was by the gift and power of God that they saw them. And this raises a question in the mind of critics, because if they actually did see them with their literal eyes, then while it's okay that you see accounts of them saying that it's with their literal eyes, there shouldn't be any other accounts saying anything other than that. Whereas if you were dealing with somebody who was not a trustworthy witness, then having them change their story in one context versus another is a red flag, because that leads you to think, well, maybe their account is being falsified in some way in order to misrepresent what actually happened. And that's why we are, as critics, we find problem with this. But defenders of the church don't want to see that as a problem, or they want to be able to paint critics as being too nitpicky for that problem. But it's a reasonable counterpoint to add. If you had somebody that you were investing your life savings with say at one point, I'm investing all of this money in secure financial instruments, and that was the only thing that you ever said, then you're like, okay. But then if you saw them at one point saying, I'm investing them with my brother Bernie, and hopefully it'll do good. I mean, the fact that that statement is also put out there and it contradicts the other statement is a huge red flag. It would immediately make you want to dig deeper and say, the fact that there are 2 different positions out there about what's actually happened now raises a big question about what is actually happening. They say that a man with 1 clock always knows what time it is. If you have 2 clocks or 2 watches, and they say something different, now you got to figure something out because something's wrong. So you either have to be a really, really, really good liar if you are misrepresenting things, or if contradictory statements come out, you're going to have to dig deep and work hard to try to reconcile those things. Now, we're getting in the comments some people saying, hey, is this the part where people were saying that it looks like Kwaku was reading a script and debating whether he wrote it or someone else? I think that raising that type of criticism about what's going on here is unfounded. If you know that you're going to go into a debate, the person moderating has told you this is the framework, we're going to let you make a 10-minute statement, then we're going to have a more lively back and forth. You're going to plan out what your statement is. You're going to write some notes, write an outline, or even write a script, and you're going to read from it because you want to be able to concisely convey your strongest points in as little time as possible with as much power and emphasis as possible. And so he's doing what any responsible debater would do, and you shouldn't criticize him for that. So let's keep going.
It's great context to John's vision in Revelation 14, as he beautifully records, I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. Joseph received the Aaronic priesthood when John the Baptist as an angelic being came down from heaven and laid his hands upon the heads of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. Afterward, Peter, James, and John of the New Testament laid their literal, physical, angelic hands on the heads of Joseph and Oliver and ordained them to the Melchizedek priesthood. At this time, they were made apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ. As Joseph's life continued, he was instructed by Jesus Christ and built the largest American-grown church ever. He restored the temple order with ordinances performed in thanksgiving of the atonement of Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross of Calvary. God commanded Joseph to restore more.
Okay, so he's doing a good job here of really trying to make the strongest argument for the foundational claims of the church. And every point that he's making is really tied to the question of, does the church actually have the authority of God? Do the men claiming to be prophets actually have that prophetic authority? And if you're realizing that that question is central to the whole Mormon proposition, then in your argument, you're going to make sure to tie the authority of God and Christ to the men that you are holding as being in that seat of power. And so he's making this argument. What he's glossing over, however, is the criticisms that some of these early brethren had about how Joseph Smith came out about these things. You know, he's talking about Peter, James, and John laying their hands on the heads of Joseph and Oliver Cowdery and giving them the first John the Baptist, the Aaronic priesthood, and then Peter, James, and John, the Melchizedek priesthood. When you go back and listen to some of the criticisms that even some of those early witnesses of the gold plates had, they'll say, well, this higher priesthood wasn't even a thing back around the time Joseph Smith is saying it was a thing. It was only later that he said, oh yeah, this happened a while ago. This is part of the same pattern of problems that people have with the first vision, saying that it seems like Joseph Smith came up with an idea and then backdated it and said this happened a while ago, and so now we're going to go forward with this principle and idea. And from that perspective, he seems much more like a religious charlatan who, when he realizes the power of certain ideas and principles and actions, then adopts them and is able to say, this happened a while ago. And so you can believe me now. If you're talking to the faithful, as a statement like Kwaku is really talking to the faithful, he's reiterating a lot of what the faithful say, then faithful people who've grown up with these ideas handed to them uncritically and unexaminedly with any context and any dissenting perspectives removed in a very whitewashed version of church history, they're simply going to accept it. Yes, this is what I've heard my whole life. The church has been very transparent about it. And this is the foundational principles upon which I base my faith. And that's the end of the story. But the problem is when you're talking to people who don't already accept as a premise the Mormon perspective of these things, it really raises questions. Wait a second, how do we know that those things happened? You know, because any religious charlatan will say something happened, but unless you have something to back it up, then it means nothing. And this is where the second aspect of Kwaku's position comes into play, and that is, look at how great the church has grown. It's tremendously wealthy. It is so wealthy that the leaked disclosure of the vast size of its wealth is major worldwide news. Not only that, but it's, one of the fastest growing and largest American religions. Now, both the wealth of the church and the speed at which it has grown in the past and the size of which it has achieved in terms of numbers have zero to do with the legitimacy of the claims of the church or the person itself. And you could just say, well, are there churches that are bigger and more wealthy in actual numbers than the Mormon church? And if there are, then if you're going to use those facts to try to bolster the case for the church, then you would have to defer the conclusions to these larger or more wealthy organizations and say, well, maybe the Catholic Church, because it's wealthier and it has larger numbers, then it must be true. Because if you're not willing to use those arguments to give the benefit to other organizations but are saving it only for your benefit, then it really doesn't make any sense. He's saying it's the wealthiest church in America. Well, is God American? Like, why does that even matter? And that's just one of those things that are, you don't even notice it if you're a believing member of the church. It just makes sense. But you have to look at it from an outside perspective. You have to say, how do people who don't already accept the church, how do they see these arguments? And it's not very convincing.
Or scriptures lost from the world and write down the revelation and divine appearances. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was established by God, the Father, and his Son, Jesus Christ. Eventually, persecution and murder by the hands of mainstream Christians drove the church out of America. The prophet Brigham Young, Joseph's successor, led the Latter-day Saints to the land we now call Utah and helped the western side of America be established. What started with a young boy in a grove of trees is now one of the most powerful religions in the world. The Lord's church and his temples dot the globe, and his Latter-day Saints are preparing the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Because of the Book of Mormon, we know Joseph Smith is a prophet.
Okay, so if you're Mormon and you're trying to make the case for the church, you have to be very careful about how you use your language and what things you're going to put at the front of your argument. Because if you say that the Mormon church is the most powerful in the world and is preparing the world for the second coming, those are some dangerous ideas to people who don't already see the goodness of the Mormon church as you as a believer might see it. And you could just take this and flip the script a little bit and just say, what if you were talking to somebody who was Muslim and they told you that the Muslim religion was the most powerful in the world and that they were all preparing the world for the great conflict that is going to come between the chosen people and the infidels. Oh, and by the way, you're an infidel. That would not be a powerful argument for you, but that's in fact what he is saying. To anyone who doesn't accept Mormonism and its goodness as a premise is going to hear what he's saying and see it as a very dangerous idea that they are not comfortable with. And if you want to see the reality of this idea that he's conveying, then if you look at the leaked interview between United States Senator Gordon Smith and the apostles and prophets that came at the inception of the the Mormon Leaks organization, then you'll see that that is in fact what Gordon Smith said. He said that he voted for the Iraq War, and one of the reasons that he made that vote was because it was going to somehow open up that side of the world or prepare that side of the world to receive the missionary efforts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, when you think about worldwide conflict that destroyed the lives and severely disrupted the existence of millions of people in another part of the world, and doing that with some sort of religious justification from a political power like the United States is a very dangerous idea. And he's right in that the church is very powerful, but if you have an organization that is powerful because of its vast wealth and because it has covenant control in secret temple ceremonies over its members who then rise to political positions in their states and in your countries, that's a dangerous idea. It's very understandable to see why the wider world in America would be concerned about somebody like Mitt Romney being the president when they learned that Mitt Romney dressed up in temple garments and raised his hand to the square, pantomimed his own death, lest he reveal what he was doing in the temple, and then swear an oath that he would give everything that he has and everything that he would have to the building up of the kingdom of God, to the church, and that included his oath to obey his religious leaders, to obey the prophet. Such, to an extent that when you see Senator Brown, then former Senator Brown, meet with the brethren, one of the things he makes it a point to say is that I've met with presidents and kings and diplomats, and I have no problem with that, but I appear before you now, and I know who you are, and I know what my covenants are, and I consider my temple recommend to be more important to me than my voter certificate. And that voter certificate was the thing that he would show up in Washington, D.C. with, indicating that he was elected by his constituency to represent them in Congress, in the Senate. And for him to say that he holds his temple recommend in higher esteem than the document that indicates he represents his constituency is a huge red flag. If you saw that in any other religious denomination, you'd say, whoa, 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 that religion and its leaders have a greatly undue amount of influence over them. So by Kwaku framing this argument that the church is powerful, it's not a good thing. That's not what people want to hear. If your religion is able to distort your values and to make you act in ways that are deferential to a religious authority or in anticipation of some mythological future that involves Armageddon and calamity, you don't want those people making political decisions in a pluralistic society where not everybody considers those things to be legitimate or truthful. I don't think Kwaku would feel comfortable if an evangelical Christian was making political decisions for the nation. And whatever you do, there's a Netflix documentary on the fact that this is probably happening behind the scenes anyway. I forget the name of it. But anyway, let's keep going.
Many people like to compare Joseph's doctrines about heaven and salvation to mainstream Christianity's view of those things. However, if the Book of Mormon is true, mainstream Christianity isn't. As opposed to comparing Joseph's post-Book of Mormon teachings with mainstream Christianity, we look to see if the Book of Mormon is true. If it is, all presuppositions coming from mainstream Christianity are mute because their teachings come from the great apostasy. So people will go to some people will go to Christian conspiracy theory websites and list supposed false prophecies of Joseph Smith, usually done by removing context, altering quotes, or just lying about the historical record. Having personally looked into these supposed false prophecies, I can state with honesty, Brother Joseph never had one false prophecy, not one ever. Never mind that Doctrine and Covenants 87.
Okay. So he's doing a slap again in the face of his evangelical Christian counterpart, and he's doing it in the mode that Joseph Smith originally modeled for him, of saying that all of their professions were corrupt. When I first watched through this, I guess I didn't pick up on this as much as I'm seeing it as I listen to it in detail now. When you speak to evangelical Christians, telling them that their Christian faith and their Christian notions, their whole Christian worldview is false, is every bit as offensive as a Mormon having somebody call them a cult. Because as much as Mormons don't want to be considered a cult, and they consider their deference and their adherence to their prophet to be an expression of their faith, so too Christians don't want to be told that their entire religious worldview is based on falsehood and apostasy, particularly when this notion of apostasy is something that Satan himself brought about. So it would make them feel like their very faith and devotion to God was something born out of a deception from Satan. And it's very uncouth. If you're going to engage with evangelical Christians, don't go there. From a Mormon perspective, you can make the case for Mormonism without having to do this. But Kwaku is kind of setting the stakes pretty high in terms of it's going to be all or nothing. He's sort of building walls between him and people on their Christian perspective rather than being as inclusive. I think this is why people really saw Gordon B. Hinckley as the great communicator as a prophet, because he was able to make the case for Mormonism from an inclusive and expansive perspective, saying we want everybody to bring their goodness to us and we'll move on together, rather than saying we're right, y'all are wrong, y'all are fruits of the great apostasy, and so you need to switch sides if you're going to be right with God, which is the case that Kwaku is making here. Now, he then goes on to say that if the Book of Mormon is true, then that's it, game over. And this is why a lot of people in their journey out of the faith really have to wrestle with the Book of Mormon. And there's a famous quote from Elder Holland where he says that people who leave this church have to leave crawling under, around the Book of Mormon. And it's very true, because the Book of Mormon is this tangible thing that exists, that's not simply somebody else telling you or something. It's this thing that exists and real. You can flip its pages, you can read its stories, and it's presented to you as having a divine origin, in that it was translated by the gift and power of God and had a very particular purpose and a particular message. And so it makes sense that then you have people like Brian Hales devoting their entire academic endeavors now to trying to strengthen the case of the divine origin of the Book of Mormon by saying, no other human mortal process could produce something like this. And I think people that leave the church have left struggling with the Book of Mormon. And when I say struggling with it, I mean that they have to deal with it. So they say, okay, well, I've heard now both sides of the argument with Joseph Smith. I've heard the people, I think in particular on the question of polygamy, I've heard the people making excuses for Joseph Smith and what he did, and then I heard the people who are critical of Joseph Smith and what he did about polygamy, and I've come to conclude that his actions on polygamy were not divinely inspired, and so that raises a question. Now that I see that the translation of the Book of Abraham was not what it was represented to be, it wasn't a literal translation of the hieroglyphics as it was proposed to be, and now we're redefining the word translate. Now I need to examine the Book of Mormon, because maybe I haven't looked at both sides of those questions. I've only looked at the people defending the Book of Mormon. I haven't actually looked at the criticisms of the Book of Mormon, and this is where I was. And so now I'm going to go and look and see how the criticisms of the Book of Mormon, and see if they compare or if they are answered adequately by the defenders of the Book of Mormon. And so that's where you go into the literary anachronisms, the technological anachronisms. That's where you look at plagiarism, where you look at all of the different criticisms that people bring out about the Book of Mormon. And that's where you have to decide whether those criticisms have a stronger case or whether the defenders make a stronger case. And if you see the same type of illegitimate defenses being made of those things, then it becomes much easier for you to say, okay, I'm leaving the church now having gone through, around, and under the Book of Mormon, because when I did that, I found that it did not stand up to scrutiny. It's true that it is a text that uses biblical language that I would be familiar with from the King James Version of the Bible, but it also contains anachronisms and inconsistencies and themes which reveal it to be a 19th century religious fiction rather than an actual historical document. And because the whole point of existence of the Mormon Church is the idea that it has legitimate authority and that it's based on true principles and ideas and a true line of succession. And part of that is that the production of the Book of Mormon was a testament to the true prophetic calling and nature of Joseph Smith. Then once the Book of Mormon is proven to be a 19th century religious fiction, no matter how it may have qualities that are worthy of admiration, if it's not a literal history and not true, then it diffuses the entire proposition of the Mormon Church as being able to set itself apart from any other denomination because of the idea of legitimate authority and priesthood power. So his arguments are not going to fly with a lot of people, and relying on the Book of Mormon falls flat once you see the problems with the Book of Mormon. Now, the idea that not a single prophecy of Joseph Smith was false. So what you can do, and Brian Hales does this when the way that he argues polygamy, is you can take any instance where somebody else would say, wait a second, that was a false prophecy. And you could say, well, that wasn't really a prophecy. We're going to consider that something else. So the classic one that people will bring up is that through a revelation, through the looking glass, he was given communication from God that they could go to Canada and sell the copyright. And a way has been prepared for them to do that. Well, they go and they do that, and it doesn't happen. They try to sell the copyright. It doesn't happen. They come back and they're like, "What's up, Joseph? I thought this was promised." And Joseph Smith looks in his seer stone again, and the answer that comes back is, well, some revelations are from God, some are from the devil, and some are just from man. And so then you could say in retrospect, well, that wasn't really a revelation. That was something that Joseph Smith just came up with his own mind, or was the influence of Satan. And so that's how we resolve that. Now, this story was out there and people didn't quite accept it. I think they were like, well, that's just apocryphal. We don't know if that actually happened. But then the Joseph Smith Papers Project came out, and the written text of that first revelation did exist in church records. And so you can go to the Joseph Smith Papers website and you can read it, and you can just realize that, you know, the way that any religious charlatan will be able to get out of some of the things that they prophesy being not coming to pass, there's some very predictable ways. One of the most predictable ways is you could say, well, that prophecy was dependent on your faith and your obedience. And if the prophecy didn't come to pass, it means that you weren't faithful enough, you weren't obedient enough. That's kind of one level of cunning. Now, then there's the even better level of cunning. If you're a really smart con man, then you're going to say, well, this prophecy didn't come to pass because I messed up. I'm not perfect. I wasn't as faithful. I didn't do some other thing that God told me to do. And so this promise thing, it's my fault. So there, your people are going to believe you even more, because not only are you explaining why your prophecy didn't work, but you're admitting fault, which no prophet would do that. That proves that you're a prophet. So that, you know, that's even better. But now he's got something that's even more interesting, which is this idea that, you know, some prophecies are from God, some are from men, some are from the devil. Now, this is a huge problem if you actually look at it from the perspective of members. And what the problem that this represents is that even a sitting prophet of God acting in that capacity is going to hear something as the voice of God enough to dictate it from a stone in the hat and have his scribe write it down and then act on it. And he's not going to be able to discern whether it's from God himself or Satan. So if you have a prophet who's not able to discern whether something handed to him as the will of the Lord is not from Satan or himself, then suddenly the office of a prophet means a whole heck of a lot less, because he has no more power to discern truth from error than anyone else. And yet, because of the influence of his words, he's able to compel people to do things with an authority that he would have no way of doing other than that. It's a huge problem, because while it does give him the back door of, if something goes wrong, he could say, well, that was just me speaking. That wasn't actually a revelation from God. People still acted on it. And so when you fast forward to the events of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, to the way that people perceived black individuals as being cursed, all of these dark parts of church history were given the power and influence that they had because they came out under the heading of the will of God or the word of God. And if you have men who, by the example of Joseph Smith's trying to sell the copyright, are not able to discern the will of God from their own opinion or from Satan himself, then the first thing that you want to do is completely eliminate the idea that anyone can speak for God, because what you're doing is you're giving them power and influence that nobody should be able to bear, because nobody should be able to override your conscience, override your judgment, override your will by saying that God, thus saith the Lord, if they are incapable of discerning thus saith the Lord from thus saith me or thus saith Satan. And so that's a big problem. Anyway, let's keep going. Okay, something is up with my computer. It's like way laggy, so I'm sorry if the audio is messed up here.
87 is an undeniably clear prophecy of the American Civil War 30 years before it occurred. Never mind that Joseph Smith's revelation in the book of Moses and the book of Abraham fulfilled prophecies of the book of Enoch. and ancient Abrahamic lore and theology Joseph didn't know about. Never mind the fact that Joseph's prophecies have come true with clarity and exactness, as opposed to the Nostradamus-type vague predictions people peddle online. The debate on Joseph Smith's prophetic reliability is first on the nature of the Book of Mormon. Everything else takes a back seat, and I'm eager to proclaim that the Book of Mormon is true. It is a spiritually enlightening, theologically accurate, geographically evidential record of truth. To quote 2 Nephi chapter 33 of the Book of Mormon, "And now, my beloved brethren, and also Jew, and all ye ends of the earth, hearken unto these words, and believe in Christ. And if ye believe not in these words, believe in Christ. And if ye shall believe in Christ, ye will believe in these words, for they are the words of Christ. And he hath given them unto me, and they teach all men that they should do good. And if they are not the words of Christ, judge ye. For Christ will show unto you with great power and great glory that they are his words at the last day. And you and I shall stand face to face before his bar, and ye shall know that I have been commanded of him to write these things, notwithstanding my weakness. And I pray the Father in the name of Christ that many of us, if not all, may be saved in his kingdom at that great and last day." Unquote. All true believers in Jesus Christ will affirm the Book of Mormon, if not in this life, then at the judgment bar of God. I'll end with my testimony that Jesus Christ is our literal and actual Savior, that his New Testament church has been reestablished on earth. I know that Jesus Christ is the Redeemer of man. I know he called Joseph Smith to be his servant. This is the truth to outshine all religionists. It is.
Okay, so I think he does a good job of making the case that a lot of Mormons will make, which is you can use Christ and the figure of Christ and the idea of Christ as really good leverage, because anybody who wants to then command control over the minds of people who hold this reverence for the Christ figure simply has to tie themselves to Christ some way, particularly in a way that gives them then authority over the individual. So you can look at any number of Christian offshoot groups that end up being high demand religions under an authoritative religious figure. And invariably, you'll find that the person there has somehow linked themselves to Christ or God in a way that then subverts the devotion that people have to Christ and makes it so they have to share that same devotion to them as the man themselves. And they'll give lip service to the idea of, you don't have to worship me as a man, we only worship Christ. But if that person is saying that they are the one who conveys the will of Christ to the members, to the world, then it's the same thing. You still have to devote, your thoughts and your actions to conforming with what this man says Christ can do. And so when you look at it's almost like this stereotype of the religious leader who claims to be Christ, and so people can do it. And if you're probably a Kmart brand religious leader who's trying to get control, then you'll say that you're Christ. That's really ridiculous, because people are just going to be like, yeah, you're more likely either a con man or schizophrenic or something. And so that's really weak. But a more powerful way to do it is that you separate yourself from Christ, but then you make yourself the conveyance through which Christ's will is known, because then people won't see you as trying to put yourself on the pedestal of Christ. They'll see you as being a servant. And it's better if you then articulate your approach as, I'm just a humble servant. I'm no better than any of you. I just, I sit in this seat. And, because then people will be like, well, they're just like us. And it's a much more effective way to insidiously have control over the minds of the people that you would lead. And you'll find examples of this. If you go and make a study of David Koresh, if you make a study of Julius Schachnow, of different people who have used the figure of Christ, the figure of God, in order to bend the devotion of their followers so that they themselves had that type of control over their followers, then you'll see it's a very common leverage. And so the Book of Mormon is absolutely effective. Yeah, and the church will make a big deal about this. If you search for the name Christ and all the different names that have been given to Christ in the Book of Mormon, you're going to find hundreds of references. It talks about the Christ out the wazoo. Okay, well, is that then proof that the Book of Mormon is, in fact, a Christian book? Because if you go and you listen to some of these other prophetic leaders, they may say the word Christ a whole heck of a lot, and they may defer and refer to Christ a whole heck of a lot, but it's all a structure built around this central principle that you have to obey the authority figure as though you are obeying Christ because he speaks for Christ. And that is in fact what the Book of Mormon does. And Kwaku, in making his argument saying that the whole notion of Joseph Smith's prophetic role is tied up in whether or not the Book of Mormon is what it represents itself to be, is an honest portrayal of that foundational perspective of the Book of Mormon. Because if it's true, then you have to deal with Joseph Smith being a prophet. But if the Book of Mormon is false, then you have to realize that the extent to which it shoots out the name of Christ is simply a sign of how effective a subversive trap it is. Because the more Christian, the more godly, the more pious an instrument might be, whose ultimate result is getting you to submit your mind and will to a man rather than to God, that makes it more dangerous a tool. The more cunning a trap, the more cunning the tool. And so I think this is actually even anticipated in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 7, when Christ is talking about that there are many who will say, Lord, Lord, did we not, cast out many demons in your name and work all manner of miracles in your name? And the whole concept there is that there are people who will use the name of Christ and do things that seem to be miracles. And the result of all of these things is to try to get people to follow and obey them. And that's a problem, because that in and of itself is a red flag. And so to the extent that people use the Book of Mormon saying, if this is true, then you have to believe Joseph Smith, which then means you have to believe the history of the church, believe the things that the prophet Joseph, Brigham Young, and subsequent prophets after them, depending on which tradition you follow, everything that they say as God's truth, as God's will. And there are huge problems with that because of the subsequent contradictions and problems in it, to say nothing of the contradictions and problems inherent to the Book of Mormon itself, or to the way Joseph conducted himself in his prophetic role. All right. Somebody else is pointing out that the Civil War prophecy, which Kwaku mentioned, is not actually accurate. And Kwaku, a little bit ago, I think one of the common defenses of critics of the church when they say that Joseph Smith's prophecies didn't actually get fulfilled, it's just people who wanted to believe he was a prophet made connections that they then said, see, the prophecy was fulfilled. Well, that's a lot of what Nostradamus, the people who are like, oh, Nostradamus predicted Hitler, he predicted World War II. And they'll say, well, people just wanting to find those connections found some things that were sort of alike, and they considered those to be positive matches. And then in their minds, that those number of positive matches justified it being a real prediction. Well, if you read Joseph Smith's predictions about the Civil War and you do that in isolation, you could say, wow, he really predicted the Civil War. If you read the prediction of Joseph Smith regarding the Civil War, and then you read the newspapers and what editors and what people paying attention to the state of the nation and the politics of the nation were talking about and anticipating might be the future for the nation, then you'll see that his revelation, or what he considered to be a revelation, wasn't too far out of the step. And if it doesn't use completely specific terms in terms of the date and exact populations of people, then it leaves things open and broad enough that if something ever happens, you can always point to it and say that it was a prediction of the future, when that's not exactly the case. And if you want some more background into how these sorts of things happen, where people use what seem to be coincidences that connect things and then give more meaning to it, you can just Google, I think it's called Lincoln and Kennedy. And there are people who have said there's so many similarities between the assassination of President Lincoln and President Kennedy. If look at all these different things that we found in common, and it's almost conspiracy theories kind of stuff, like just all these coincidences where Okay, one coincidence maybe, but when there's so many coincidences, then that just proves that something is up and that there was some way for people to know it. And it's a cognitive bias. It's using something called the sharpshooter fallacy to try to make the case of something, and it's from a misunderstanding of how truth is established, where you have to challenge falsifiability, which means that you don't look at the coincidences that seem to support your assertion. You look at the things which would prove it false. You look at the things that are contradictory, and it's whether or not some proposition is able to survive an examination of the contradictory evidence, not the supporting evidence, but the contradictory evidence. And that's how you can establish the truth of a proposition. But let's keep going with what Kwaku's talking about here.
Is God's direction in his kingdom. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sam. I'll call you Sam. Thank you, Kwaku. I appreciate you for that opening statement. All right, Sam, you got it for 10 minutes.
All right. Praise be the God and Father of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I ask the Holy Spirit to fill me to glorify Jesus and expose all false prophets and false teachings that seek to...
Okay, so there's already just a difference in how Sam here is starting out his thing. So he's doing what is probably considered evangelical Christian virtue signaling, and that he's starting out and he's invoking the name of God in what he's going to say. And the idea, particularly for people who already accept his position, is that they're now going to consider what he has to say as having some sort of additional veracity or legitimacy because he invoked God before he said it. Kwaku didn't have to go there, but the religion itself invoked the authority of God in how he presented his arguments. So it's also weird how he's kind of taking almost a lackadaisical approach to it. I think from just a stylistic approach, it's really hard to watch these debates because you have Kwaku, who's very capable in presenting an argument in an eloquent way that is full of animation and feeling and emotion, and doing it in a way that's actually appealing to young people, which is something that evangelical Christians are just not able to do. And so you're already going to feel kind of a difference in this.
To usurp the glory of Jesus and his word, the Holy Bible, in Jesus' name. Now, what you just heard from Kwaku is a series of assertions that I hear Muslims make all the time. Everything he said about Joseph Smith, they say about Muhammad. Muhammad made prophecies that were fulfilled. Muhammad's message is consistent with the true revelation that came before him, etc., etc., etc. Ironically, Muslims are actually closer to Christians than Mormons, because Mormons are, for all intents and purposes, polytheists and idolaters, as I'm going to seek to demonstrate. But let me grant just one argument.
So I think critics of this particular debate, and I think, he's saying things very declaratively as though they are fact that are critical of Kwaku and Mormons. I guess he's not really critical of Kwaku, but he's saying Kwaku said these things, pointing out that they're polytheists, and it's something that I think a lot of Mormons might feel like he's being unfair to them by distorting and misrepresenting their faith by focusing on certain things that they know will become inflammatory to evangelical Christians. But now that we've kind of been through Kwaku's opening statement, you can understand that Kwaku did something very similar to this in how he framed his position of the church itself. So I guess I don't really discount him too much for that.
That Kwaku made. Let's assume that Joseph Smith made a true prophecy. That still is not a basis to assume that he's a true prophet, because in Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 to 5, we're told that if a dreamer of dreams or a prophet says that something will take place, and it takes place, but then says, "Come, let us worship gods that you have not known," do not do it, for the Lord your God is testing you.
So he's already getting into the weakness and the problem that people entering into these debates have, and that is that they're not willing to challenge the statements and the assertions of Mormonism or its defenders on the grounds of the argument alone. They are appealing to the authority of the Bible which Mormons already can diffuse because they already accept the notion that the Bible is contradictory and problematic. And they've been raised having those contradictions pointed out to them because it is the Book of Mormon and the restored gospel which answers those contradictions. And so he's already speaking a vocabulary that means nothing to Kwaku because he's grounding his arguments in the Bible. And I think to anyone that if you're going to engage in debates in the Bible and you're going to use the Bible to justify some counterpoint that you're using, you have to remember that your opponent can point out some inconsistency in the Bible and then say, okay, well, if you're going to use the Bible, they can point out something terribly erroneous and wrong in the Bible. And one of the most common things is God commanding the genocide through the prophet Moses of like the Midianites or something in the Old Testament. Well, they can say, well, if you're going to tell me that the Bible is your standard of moral authority and truth, how do you justify genocide? And it's one of those quandaries that I don't think Mormons even defend that because they use that story to teach obedience. But it's one of those things where you have to either adopt a very horrible moral position in order to continue to defend things from the position of the Bible being literalistically true versus Mormonism. Now, the problem is, I think defenders of Mormonism could say, okay, well, if we're going to accept that the Bible itself may have truths and is more of a mythology history of certain peoples, and if we're going to accept that, okay, well, let's also accept the Book of Mormon being that, a mythology. You know, we don't have to accept it as literally true. But because Kwaku just formulated his entire argument on the idea that the legitimacy of Joseph Smith's status as a prophet is dependent on the Book of Mormon being what it was represented to be, that if you then take the Book of Mormon and say, we're going to reimagine it being religious scripture in the mode of mythology, then you are cutting the argument for the legitimacy of Mormonism off at its feet because you based the legitimacy of Joseph's prophetic role on its historicity and its literalness. Okay, so I'm seeing somebody saying this guy must be an atheist. I assume that they're talking about me. And this is one of the things that I don't really go into my own personal beliefs in my channel because my beliefs are irrelevant to the subject at hand. If you cannot defend Mormonism on the grounds of logic and rationality, then it doesn't have anything to do with whatever I believe. On top of that, if you're going to take the idea that, well, we have to defend and accept the Bible and then we can refute Mormonism, well, I mean, if you're going to use a certain set of tools and logic to refute Mormonism, you have to be able to apply them to other things. And I think there are different modes and ways of expressing and existing in a religious space that don't depend on very concrete, literal ways of approaching religion. And there are some of those things that can be very inspiring and uplifting, particularly when you have the fellowship of other people who are willing to gather around good aspects of religion and have the freedom to discard those which are immoral and unethical and hurtful. Now, that's just being said without asserting any truth of any particular faith or denomination. I think that's just an idea that anyone entering into any religion needs to understand, is that if I enter into a religion and it starts using dogma to compel me to hate other people or to behave and act in ways that are hurtful or harmful to other people, then that's a red flag. And I need to be wary of that. And because coming out of Mormonism, I've seen how religious charlatans work, and I've seen how deception and psychological manipulation that pulls on levers of religion, then I think that those red flags are worthy of understanding. And when you see those red flags in other organizations, because Mormonism is only one of a plethora of organizations that use those types of levers of control. So if you're in a Bible-believing church, in a faith-believing church, and you start seeing the same elements of spiritual coercion and control, then you should say, wait a second, that's a red flag, and I need to start paying more attention. All right, so let's keep going.
So all this proves is that Satan empowered Joseph Smith to say something that came true in order to mislead people like Kwaku in following a false God and reject the true God revealed in Scripture. But
okay, so he's already he's approaching this, I think, the wrong way. He's saying that, okay, well, let's assume that Joseph Smith made a prophecy that was right, and then we'll say that Satan is the one that allowed him to make that prophecy. Okay, that is one way to counteract the argument that Joseph predicted something, it must be true. The other way is to say, well, hold on a second. Let's look at an example of one of his predictions, and then let's really do a deep investigation and see if it came to pass. Because you can go and look at any number of people who make predictions. So recently, Julie Rowe, who is a self-proclaimed prophetess, offshoot of Mormonism, made a prediction that there would be earthquakes in Utah preceding some great tribulation and some big call out. Well, that prediction was made shortly before an earthquake actually hit Utah in the midst of this worldwide pandemic. Does the fact that Julie Rowe made this accurate prediction mean that she is a prophet and now we have to obey her, just as Kwaku laid out the argument that the Book of Mormon and prophecies prove Joseph Smith was a prophet, so now we have to obey him and follow him? Well, no, it doesn't. And that's where you really have to examine the nature of these prophetic claims and see if they actually meet a standard. And on top of that, you have to have an understanding of the concept of falsifiability that we talked about before. If somebody makes a bunch of statements that they have a good understanding statistically is going to be true at some point in the future, that doesn't make them a prophet. It makes them understand the notion of making statements for something you know is going to eventually happen and do it in a vague enough way that when it does happen, you can claim credit for it. So we have, for example, Kenneth Copeland, using the breath of God to blow away COVID-19. And he, as long as he continues to do things in his self-proclaimed role as prophet to blow away COVID-19 and to get rid of COVID-19, he's just going to keep doing it. And then at some point, the virus is going to go on the downward trend and we'll go back to a baseline, and he's going to be able to claim that he did it. Now, that doesn't mean that he's a prophet because he used the power of God to make COVID-19 go away. It's just he understands how these things happen, and he capitalized on it to gain more followers and to seem to have the power that he doesn't actually have. All right, so let's continue. I think if you're going to engage in these things, it's much more powerful to do that than it is to ground your counter argument in the Bible.
But Kwaku's battle is not with me. Kwaku's battle is with his own prophet, Joseph Smith. Because if you read the Book of Mormon, because he appealed to the Book of Mormon, and so now he's stuck with it, because my citations will come from the Book of Mormon. And I want you to be leery of words being misinterpreted or redefined or twisted in order to avoid the plain reading of the passages. For example, was Joseph Smith a polytheist? Was he a Trinitarian? Or was he a modalist? Well, it depends which source you read. If I read, for example, the Book of Mormon, Mosiah, chapter 15, verses 1 to 4, surprise, surprise, Joseph Smith was a modalist heretic who thought that Jesus is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Here, let me give you the quotes.
Okay, so he's already using, he talked about being careful about language and redefining language, and I think those are absolutely great caveats to give before you enter into a discussion. One of the things that any close group of people who have their own flavor of religious interpretation, their own internal culture, they're going to have a vocabulary that is meaningful to them in a way that may not be meaningful to the outside world. Mormonism recently made this abundantly clear in trying to reconcile what seems to be Joseph Smith lying to the world and to the church about polygamy, because when you start researching the subject of polygamy, you can find several instances where Joseph Smith denied that he had anything as a plural wife other than Emma. And when you look at that in retrospect, now that the church has acknowledged that Joseph Smith did engage in polygamy with Emma, it would seem like he's lying. And so what the church has done in, I think it's footnote number 21 in the Gospel and Topic essay on polygamy, plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, it is said that Joseph Smith made carefully worded denials. So he used special words. And then they tell you what he did is he had a secret definition of polygamy, which was different from celestial marriage. And he could say, we're not engaging in polygamy because polygamy means any plural marriage without the sanction of the prophet. But celestial marriage is plural marriage with the sanction of the prophet. So he could stand up and say, we're not doing anything like polygamy, but they don't bother to make the public aware of that distinction so that they understand that, yes, they are in fact engaging in plural marriage, but not polygamy. Now that's one level of understanding. The other level of understanding is if you actually go and you read the statements made by the brethren, they're not saying we don't practice polygamy. They're actually going a step beyond, and they're saying that we don't practice in anything other than what is written in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 101. And if you go and read Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, it specifically says that the only marriages which are valid are those which are publicly performed, only one man to one woman. And those, a man can get married again if his first wife dies. And so it wasn't just that they were denying polygamy. They were outright saying, we have in our Doctrine and Covenants what our marriage doctrine is, and we don't do anything other than that. So when you understand that they are misrepresenting those public denials in order to claim that they were carefully worded, then you can see that the church is in fact lying to its members today, just as it did back in the day. But that's just speaking to this idea that you do need to be careful of secret private definitions, even words that have multiple definitions. For an evangelical Christian to engage a Mormon and talk about things like salvation and exaltation, you're going to be totally missing the mark, because Mormons have a concept of salvation being different from exaltation in very specific ways that Christians don't understand. And not only that, but Mormons then say the word salvation can have, I think Bruce R. McConkie said it can have 6 different meanings. And so you have to just make sure that you're talking about the same thing when you're talking about it. And so that's how Mormons can say that the Book of Mormon has the fullness of the gospel. Well, they are constraining the gospel to represent faith, baptism, laying on of hands, and repentance. That's the gospel. And so all of this other stuff that includes temple ceremony and second anointings and all this other appendage additional stuff, well, if the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the gospel, why isn't that in there? Well, they'll say, well, the gospel is just those 4 things. All this other stuff is, the fullness of the restoration. It's other stuff. And so that's where, again, paying attention to this language is important. Now, he goes on then to do kind of the same thing, but from the evangelical Christian side, in that he points out that there are parts of the Book of Mormon that seem to describe modalism, and then he immediately brands Joseph Smith a heretic. And you just have to understand that on the non-Mormon Christian side, there have been people who have interpreted Scripture to portray God and the relationship between God and Christ in different ways. And, part of the quandary that Joseph Smith had that led him to be able to make these statements clarifying a lot of that is that you had people who considered God to be formless and shapeless and filling the whole universe, and then you had other people who saw it differently, and you had people who considered Christ to be a manifestation of God in a different form, and other people who consider, there's all different ways of conceiving the God. If you just take some time and go through the Wikipedia page on the Trinity and the Godhead, you're going to see that throughout history there have been multiple groups who've had different takes on it. And he can call Joseph Smith a heretic for being a modalist, but if you go and you talk to a group of people who have unifiedly by themselves seen what this guy is calling modalism and accepted it as their conception of God and Christ, then to themselves, they're not considered heretics. They're just considered, who they are. It's just a label that is emotionally charged. It's branding somebody as an outsider. And if we can slap it onto Joseph Smith, then it paints him in a bad picture. And to his audience, who are evangelical Christians, they're just going to accept that without question. Oh, Joseph Smith is a heretic. Of course he was a heretic. He's a false prophet. You don't have to resort to that in order to point out the problems. Labels like heretic and apostate and false prophet are labels that you can leave up to the listener to decide they want to give Joseph Smith. but you weaken your argument by applying them yourself, saying that he was a false prophet. You can say that prophecies that he made did not come true, and then allow that conclusion to come into the mind of your viewer, and they'll make that conclusion or not make it based on the strength of your argument. These are really hard rhetorical things to keep in line, especially when you're in the middle of an emotional debate or an emotional presentation, because it's very easy to let your own conclusion slip through and color what you're saying rather than relying on the nature of your arguments itself. I do this myself, so you'll find times where I may slip into saying those things, but to the extent that I do, I weaken my position if I can simply stick to making the arguments and what I believe the conclusions to be from them, but then give the viewer and the audience the space to come to their own conclusions. You're going to be more compelling as a debate partner. All right, so let's keep going.
Mosiah chapter 15, verses 1 to 4. And now Abinadi, excuse me for butchering these names, I would that ye should understand that God himself shall come down among the children of men, and shall redeem his people, and because he dwelleth in the flesh, he shall be called the Son of God. And having subjected the flesh to the will of the Father, being the Father and the Son. And then going on, thus becoming the Father and Son, they are one God, yea, the very eternal Father of heaven and of earth. Here's another one, Mosiah 16, verse 15. Teach them that redemption cometh through Christ the Lord, who is the very eternal Father.
Okay, so he's going to go through a litany of what I would consider to be theological counter-arguments to Mormonism. And it's always difficult to watch these things because people who argue theologically against Mormonism can only do so to the extent that the theological counterpoints that they make are accepted in the mind of their audience. And one of the difficulties of the wider Christian world, outside of religious paradigms where absolute truth is handed to you, is that the ambiguity inherent to Scripture allows people to come to their own conclusions and do so on the strength of their own judgment, and that is going to produce, because we are all varied in our thoughts and proclivities and values, then you're going to come out with a wide variety of interpretations. And some people will coalesce around other people who share some of their main interpretation points, but there's going to be a wide variety. And so if you're making theological counter-arguments, you're relying on your audience to believe the same things about those theological points that you are. And if somebody else disagrees on your particular theological interpretation, then you've lost the argument to them. And so I think that doing a debate where you're trying to disprove the Book of Mormon on theology alone is very weak, because you don't know that your audience is going to agree with your theological counterpoints. It is completely possible to address the Book of Mormon and its claimed historicity on things that are irrelevant to theology. I mean, you don't have to, you can talk about textual dependency, where if you have, in time, one text generated at one point in time, and then another text claiming to be earlier than that text, but having exact verbiage from that text in it, therefore proving that it is dependent on this text, even though it claims to come before that text, that is an argument that you don't even have to get into what the text is. You can just show the percentage of words that match the exact word, the exact order, the exact number of things. And that is something that is an effective argument making the case that the book is a 19th century fiction, not an actual ancient historical document. And you don't even have to get into theology, because not everyone may agree with your theological counterpoint. And I think that those types of arguments are much more effective, because you don't then have to make sure that and dig for your theology, because you can have very creative religious minds that try to really, Christ did say that he had sheep of other folds. It's in the Bible. So surely some of those other folds are going to do what the prophets in the Old and the New Testament did. They're going to write down about their experience with Christ, and it's going to make sense. And that type of being able to draw on those open holes that lead the way for future revelation, future scripture is part of Joseph Smith's genius. But it's also part of Chris Nemelka's genius, because Chris Nemelka, who famously published what he said was the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon, and went on to publish the lost 116 pages and other things that he claimed were scripture, he was able to take those gaps that existed in the Book of Mormon, stories about, well, what was the revelation that the brother of Jared had? Well, he was able to take some of those open plot holes and fill them in, and then try to tie his religious authority to the fact that he filled them in the exact same pattern that Joseph Smith did here. But you want to be able, and it's completely possible to point out inconsistencies, contradictions, anachronisms in his scriptural product without even having to worry about the theology. All right, so let's keep going here.
I hope Kwaku brings up Isaiah 9:6 and try to justify.
I'm not really going to go into his theological arguments, because it's a forest that I'm not prepared to go into the weeds on, other than, again, he just brought up the Isaiah. Well, you can look at the theological underpinnings of Isaiah and try to figure out if Joseph Smith matched that or contradicted it. Or you could say, well, wait a second, what about Deutero-Isaiah? There's a chronicity inherent to what we're learning about the origin of the book of Isaiah. And if it contradicts the proposed timeline of the Book of Mormon, then that in and of itself is something which establishes it as a later text and not a current text. Just as much as like finding a cell phone in a story about Abraham Lincoln would show that, it's an anachronism. All right, so it would be Yugi, calm down. Okay, so Heidi says it would be fun if Kwaku called in. I agree. I've sent some private messages to Kwaku. He hasn't responded to me. I don't think he's even looked at it. I don't know if he uses Messenger or what. It doesn't seem like he has me blocked, but I sent him a message a while ago inviting him to be on a discussion about the issue of race in Mormonism, but I never heard back from him, and I don't think he's seen the message. So I would love for him to, if he writes a comment here, then I will private message him a link where he could call in and join us. That would be great, but I don't anticipate that would happen. Okay, so I want to fast forward here just because I can't take all this guy.
Later statements of false prophets that.
Okay, so
Boring. Time I got Marlon.
A lot of this debate gets bogged down in the fact that he is trying to raise the point about whether or not Joseph Smith was a modalist, whether he believed that Christ was the Father or not, and the fact that there's some inconsistencies in the Book of Mormon where it would seem to say that Christ was both the Father and the Son. And he's trying to pin Kwaku down on that. And then Kwaku spends some time trying to present a counter argument.
In Facebook,
there's a very big generational difference here, right? I'm not saying Sam's old, but and so because of that, I just want to make clear, I don't want this discussion to be using words like cultist or cult or anything like that. It isn't helpful. It brings a spirit of darkness, and this is not going to be like the normal debates you see where it's like yelling back and forth. Oh, you're a cultist, you're wrong, of the devil. It doesn't.
Okay, so in the middle of the guy's argument, he does use the word cult. He doesn't specifically call Mormonism a cult, but he says that Mormonism is doing the same thing that other cults do, which is a soft way of calling Mormonism a cult. And I do that very frequently. I will show things that other groups do that even Mormons would say they're cult. I remember when I was a Mormon, I would be like, yeah, Scientology is a cult. I mean, totally a cult. Look at all that crap. And so I know Mormons call other religions cults because they can see the way that other religions influence their minds and members, but they don't see it themselves. And it's the same in those religions. If you go there on the Thoughts on Things or the Thinker of Thoughts YouTube channel, you can see the farewell videos of the Heaven's Gates victims. These were people that were followers of a guy claiming to be a Christ figure who was helping them evolve to the next level beyond human, and that ended up in a mass suicide. But before they did that mass suicide, they all recorded exit statements. And it's almost as though you could hear the leader saying, if we do this, everyone else is going to think we're a cult. And so we need to prove that we're not a cult by you talking about your decision to do this act that they understood was going to end their existence on this plane. You need to explain that you're making the decision of your own free will and that you're not in a cult, you're not brainwashed. That way the world will know that everyone has their free agency. And so when you listen to those statements, every one of those individuals is able to make a statement, and a big focus of that is them saying, I'm not in a cult. I'm not in a cult. And so there's a post that I made a few years ago on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website, where I went to each of these major groups, each of whom would look out at the other groups and say, oh yeah, they're a cult. The Jehovah's Witnesses would look at Scientology and Mormonism and say, yeah, those guys are totally cults. The Moonies would look at Mormonism and Scientology and say, oh yeah, those guys are totally cults. And everyone thinks everybody else is a cult. But in each of those websites, I was able to find some entry where the church themselves say, we're not a cult. And they'll either say, we're not a cult, or any religious organization is a cult. So if you're going to call us a cult, you have to call every religion a cult, and that's how you diffuse that sort of thing. But that's not what people mean when they say cult. When people say cult, they mean that it's a group that seems to follow an authoritarian paradigm where all decisions and thought processes and information is rigidly controlled to the extent that people have the choices that they make for their own lives so structured and so limited that they seem to come out in this cookie cutter pattern, and it ultimately is harmful and destructive to the individual's lives because it distorts people's existence. And there's different levels of harm of these groups. But at any rate, regardless of all of those realities, if you're going to engage in a discussion with somebody who is in one of those groups, you don't call their group a cult, because, as Kwaku correctly points out, it is not helpful. There's no formal definition of the word cult. It's simply an emotionally charged word that you throw at someone to try to immediately poison the well for your audience who's listening to them. And if you can't make a case for why certain teachings and practices are harmful, unethical, or immoral without using the word cult, then you need to take some time and study those things until you're able to do that, because that is how you're going to effectively reach things. If you can reach a point of agreement where something that some other group has, is unethical, immoral, and wrong, then you may not even have to point that out to your interlocutor, because your goal is not to get them to say they were wrong. Your goal is simply to increase an understanding about why certain teachings and ideas and practices are inherently wrong. And the more that happens, the more people will start to realize that if those constitute the majority of their religious framework, then they need to start looking at their own religious framework with the same critical eye that they look at any other harmful, toxic religious ideology. And it takes a while to get to that point and to that threshold. But that's the argument, that's the case that you can make. And you could imagine if you had a chance to go and interview those people in Heaven's Gate who are about to commit that act, and tell them, you're in a cult, he's controlling you, he's not what he proposes to be. Well, they've already been well prepared for the idea that they would have adversity and persecution, because people don't want the truth and the light. And this is what their leaders have prepared them to say. They're going to persecute you for the sake of the church. And so the more that you actually do that, the more you're proving to them that their leaders were true, because their leaders almost prophesied that this was going to happen. And you're just bringing that into pass. Okay, so I don't want to spend, I just want to get to the point where Kwaku makes his counterpoint and then they end up leaving.
It's not helpful, and it kind of veers everything off track. So if those words are used in that sort of thing, I won't be able to do this. So I think we can both make it more professional and friendly that way. So
yeah, can I comment on that real quick? No, before you ask a question, you made a statement, let me comment. Because I don't want you to leave the discussion and engage me, out of respect for you, not for Joseph Smith, I'll refrain from the language. But to call someone a cultist or a false prophet, that's thoroughly biblical. So I'm being faithful to the scriptures and how the prophets and the apostles addressed false teachers and those who pervert.
Okay, so again, he doesn't have to root that counter argument or even his concession in the Bible. I don't know that the word cult exists in the Bible in the way that we use it in the vernacular. It's possible for you to say that Joseph Smith made prophecies that were false and asserted authority that was false without having to use the word cult, but this guy doesn't do that. But Kwaku appropriately drew a boundary. And this is something that sometimes it's hard for Mormons to do. Kwaku drew a boundary. He said, if you're going to continue to use this language, I'm not going to participate. And the Sam here is saying, okay, I'll do it out of respect for you, but you have to understand it's completely acceptable from my perspective for me to use this language. And he could have said, just as you consider it to be acceptable to say that the entire Christian world is false, it's acceptable for me to say that Joseph Smith was a false prophet. If you're going to impose that on me, then you should have the courtesy allowing me to frame Joseph Smith in a way that is comparable to how you've framed my faith. But he doesn't do that. He says, I'll just do it out of deference to you. And to his credit, he does not, after he says this, that he's not going to use the word cult, he doesn't use it again in the discussion.
Perverted doctrine. But you just said you won't do this. So not to give you an excuse to leave, I'll refrain from that. But please do not tell me how to address a man who claims to restore a gospel that hasn't been distorted. And that's the discussion. But for the sake that you stay and not leave, I'll refrain because I don't want you to leave. I want you to engage me. So again, go ahead.
Perfect. So my first question is, you talked about the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. You read a bunch of verses of the Book of Mormon. We can sort of talk about either of them, but I wanted to ask you first, when was the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible completed?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you, but that's irrelevant.
Well, it actually was never completed. So you were speaking about it as if it was a correction.
There, though? Hold on, let me interject there.
Okay, so this is something that it was really frustrating to watch Kwaku do, and it brought to mind, this is something that in watching my own discussions or reflecting back on some of my discussions, I do this to an extent as well, and it's something I need to change about my approach to things. But what he's doing is he's taking some esoteric bit of knowledge that he, as a Mormon, may know and understand. In particular, he is somebody who's had to engage in these types of discussions before. And he's taking that bit of knowledge and then challenging his opponent with it, with the idea that he can point out the ignorance of his opponent. And that may not be his motive, but you'll see later that he says that. He says, okay, well, when the guy eventually, he tries to get the guy to say, it's not on this particular point, but a different point about how Joseph Smith characterized Christ as the Father. He said, do you know when he said this? Do you know when he said this? And the guy is not willing to say, I don't know, because it's a sign of weakness. And Kwaku eventually says, okay, well, you don't know about that. I was just trying to see if you had actually done your research on it. And so it's a ploy to try to point out a deficiency of knowledge in your opponent so that you can then invalidate their entire perspective. And it's a type of ad hominem where you're trying to do a gotcha that really just doesn't have any role in this type of discussion, and his opponent should be okay with not knowing everything because he doesn't know everything. And he tries to do that a few times, but in this case, do we know when Joseph Smith? No. I mean, if you're posed with that question, you can just say, I don't know the exact date, but I would probably guess that a majority of church members don't know the date. I could find it if that's critical to this argument. But if you'd like to go ahead and make the point that you're making, then I'll address that, because it sounds like you have a good point that you're trying to make. So what is that point? I mean, that then allows the discussion to proceed and also validates your opponent. And I think it's important in a discussion to validate the position of your opponent, the character of your opponent, and who, the fact that you respect them as an individual and in their position, because you can't expect any degree of complimentary feelings or emotions or respect if you're not willing to give them. And it's hard in the heat of a debate to admit that you don't know something, but it's an important aspect of it. Okay, so I don't want to get too bogged down in this
Whether it's
particular
completed or
argument.
not, the passages I cited, is it from that translation or no?
Well, you're citing them as if it's actually a correction, but the
No,
Joseph
I didn't say
translation of the Bible never claimed to be a correction.
no.
Okay, so this is one of Kwaku's arguments in this part of the debate, where he's saying that the Joseph Smith translation was not a correction. It was just Joseph Smith writing his opinions down about some things. Now, I can encourage you to go to Fair Mormon's website, and Kwaku does this, and to Maxwell Institute, and they'll have articles and posts addressing this issue. And in the midst of doing that, also go to Mormon Think and go to the CES letter and any other critical source and read both sides of the argument. And you can read the conclusions that the authors in each of those sources make, but don't forget to click on their citations and to read the actual source documents in context. And if they're good, they're also going to link you to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, where you can see the actual documents written at the time. And you can hear Joseph Smith. You can read what the scribes listening to Joseph Smith saying God told him to do in terms of creating this translation. On top of that, you can go back and you can read what Bruce R. McConkie had to say about the Joseph Smith translation, that it was the most correct of any of the Bibles, and that that was part of the justification for incorporating certain aspects of the Joseph Smith translation into the footnotes of the Revised Scriptures that came out in the 80s, to including certain chapters of it in the Pearl of Great Price, is because of the value and worth of these things. And from the position of the church, you have to accept that there is value and worth, because God himself commanded it of Joseph. You can read that in the revelations that are available in the Doctrine and Covenants on the Joseph Smith Papers website. Sometimes it's not clear to us, because it'll just say, God's thus saith the Lord, that in the work that I've directed you to do. And it just sounds, from today, it's like, oh, he's just talking about building up the church. But when you go back and you read the actual context and the work that he's talking about Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon doing, he's specifically referring to them translating the Bible, doing what's now called the inspired translation. And that's just one of the problems with this debate, is that Kwaku is debating somebody who really doesn't have a deep understanding of the history and problems with the church. He has probably just the superficial understanding of having read a few texts that show contradictions and inconsistencies. He could not even pronounce Abinadi the correct way. He called it Abinadi. That's just kind of one of those things that if you're talking to a Mormon audience, if you're trying to convince a Mormon audience, then you're not going to really have any power to do that if you're making those type of slip-ups. Okay.
No, I didn't say it was. Let me correct you again. You're misrepresenting me, and that's not going to get far in this discussion. Don't misrepresent me. I said what is stated is a distortion of what's found in Luke and Matthew. Luke and Matthew do not read the way the Joseph Smith translation says. So please don't put words in my mouth. I'm going to correct you before you do so. So now answer my question. Did what I quote, hold on. What I quoted, is it in the Joseph Smith translation, yes or no?
Yes, it is. It is in the Joseph Smith
Thank
translation.
you.
However, the way you were speaking about translation, you were using these words as if the Joseph Smith translation said it was a correction. And in fact, it didn't claim to be. Our church, the Church of Jesus Christ, doesn't actually own
so what is the
rights
Joseph
to the
Smith
JST
translation?
Bible.
Okay, let's try this again, because you're going on a tangent. Kwaku, be patient. You're going on a tangent. I'm going to correct.
Okay, so again, this is where I really wish that Kwaku's opponent was more elegant with how he interacted with this. It's okay to let Kwaku finish his argument and then deal with that argument. Kwaku's going down here saying the Joseph Smith translation is not a real, it's not official scripture. It is actually owned by the Community of Christ. The documents to it are owned by that. You can let Kwaku finish that argument, and then you could just say, okay, then, are you willing to say that you don't consider the Joseph Smith translation to be authoritative, to be the will and mind of God, the revelations that Joseph Smith gave about God commanding him to finish it, and that only when it was done he would then move on to build up the church. All of those revelations you believe were false or wrong, or you dismiss them. It's just, there's so many more ways that he could go about letting Kwaku finish his argument and then continuing, but he talks over it, and he's really paternalistic in the way that he deals with Kwaku. He's older. He's going to show Kwaku how things are really done. He's been around the block a few more times, and it's not going to play in this discussion, particularly to Kwaku's usual audience, which are younger people. They're going to see that as really off-putting. Here's another old guy just talking over one of my peers, telling him he doesn't know anything, and it's ridiculous. And when he's defending then the evangelical Christian side, which the Mormon audience, in particular if they're young, have been already programmed their entire lives to feel some suspicion of and feel persecution by, then it's going to be problematic.
Correct you along the way. He is quoting.
All right, let's move forward.
However, I can't talk about those things before I finish my sentence.
Yes.
Because
go ahead. Get to the meat of the matter.
So, yeah, I encourage all people watching this to go to those websites to look at those things to find the timeline of the JST. But presenting it as if it's a replacement of the Bible is totally
This is
accurate.
the time to ask questions.
The
Don't
opposite of
pontificate.
the
Get to your
historical
questions. Get to your questions. Don't pontificate, because when you do that, you're going to.
Okay, more paternalistic stuff. All right, I want to get to the part later, right before he leaves.
Jesus Christ, I am the Father and the Son. Okay, so now I am the God of Israel and the God of the whole earth. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are one, and he doesn't even specify the kind of oneness.
Right, but obviously there's more than one quote about Jesus being the Father. You can rely on one quote. You can look at the plethora. I'm asking the authoritative words of that. Jesus is the Father of blank.
Okay, Kwaku, you're not helping your case.
Let's allow him to respond, Kwaku.
You're not solving the dilemma for your case, because I started my statements by saying Joseph Smith contradicts himself in the Book of Mormon and later statements. So if you want to harmonize them, give me your best so we can see whether your harmonization is a desperate spin or is it faithful to the context. The statements I quoted.
Okay. Now, Father, I pray unto thee for them and all over the Book of Mormon. And actually,
I want to show me where he makes.
I want to get to the point where Kwaku's really pressing him to say that he doesn't know something, because that's interesting.
We can talk about supposed contradictions and all those things, but the first question I've asked, and I'm repeating it till I get an answer, according to Joseph Smith and Latter-day Saint doctrine, Jesus is the Father of blank. Please fill in the blank.
According to Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, he doesn't make such qualification. And maybe it's there. Prove me wrong. I'm not a scholar. Go ahead. Show me where he makes that qualification in the Book of Mormon.
I'm asking, do you not know? It's okay. I would just like a simple answer.
Give me from the book. I've been saying, show me from the Book of Mormon the qualification. Educate me.
Okay, so this is that moment where Kwaku really, really, really wants him to say he doesn't know, because that's a gotcha, and it's like, I won that thing. And maybe this is part of like traditional debate or formal debate, where if you can point out a lack of knowledge in your opponent, that somehow you've won a point or whatever. But it's not really effective here. Maybe, I think, all of his entourage that may be watching this and supporting him will probably feel like he won something in that regard, but I don't think it does him any credit in this.
It's great. You don't know. According to Latter-day Saint doctrine and Joseph Smith, overwhelmingly, Jesus is the Father of our salvation. So he's the Father of our salvation, and because of that, I'm continuing to answer. Because of that, it makes all of those verses in context. You can find that all over the Book of Mormon. And actually, let's read some of it. Let's read some of it.
Okay, so that's the big gotcha from Kwaku, is that the guy based a lot of his counter argument on modalism in the Book of Mormon and how that depicted Christ as a heretic. And so Kwaku just was able, I don't know if he did this, but you can do this. If you're a Mormon who hasn't confronted this argument, then one of the things that you're going to do is, well, how have other defenders of the church confronted this argument? You're going to go to Fair Mormon's website, you're going to look up modalism, and you're going to find Fair Mormon's article on it, and it's going to point out that there's a part of the Book of Mormon where you could interpret what's being said as Christ being the Father of our salvation. And so then that's how you can say that, and it's not literally like that. Kwaku almost depicts it as though Joseph Smith is saying that Christ is the Father of our salvation, like left and right here. If you go to the let's pull this up here. Go to the Fair Mormon website on this question. You can say Christ is the Father of our salvation. It gives a reference of Mosiah 5:7. Now, because of the covenant which ye have made, ye shall be called the children of Christ, his sons and his daughters. For behold, this day he hath spiritually begotten you. For ye say that your hearts are changed through faith on his name. Therefore you are born of him and have become his sons and daughters. So you can find that reference, and then you can find what the guy is alluding to, which is that there seems to be parts of the Book of Mormon that describe Christ as both the Father and the Son, and others that don't. And so it seems to be an inconsistency. This is just another example where when there are contradicting things, you can simply zone in on the one that supports your position and then refute any critics in that regard. But shortly after this exchange where Kwaku made this point, the moderator tries to...
talks about...
Let's see if we can
So let
find
me
it.
address him, because I quoted
YouTube, but also for the audience. The audience is complaining right now that you guys are talking over each other. Okay, you guys. So let's make sure that we don't go on a monologue. Let's make sure that we're dialoguing and we're asking questions. That's important. All right.
Yeah, and Marlon, he hasn't. He's been going into these speeches because he's going to damage control. So let me address him, because I quoted
right there. That was the moment right there. Kwaku hung up. So the question, I guess, is, was he justified in hanging up? And this is where if you're going to engage in this type of debate, on one hand, you should know what you're in for, particularly if you're going up against somebody when they've told you your name. It wasn't a surprise that he was going up against Sam. Then you're probably going to look at some of the past work that Sam has done so that you can understand how he approaches his arguments, you can understand his debate style, and you're going to kind of know what to expect. To Kwaku's credit, he set some groundwork ahead of time. He said, let's not devolve into name calling. Let's not use the word cult. Let's try to focus on the ideas that we're talking about. And even with that set, I think we saw that the way that Sam approached Kwaku, the way that he treated him in the debate, was far from ideal and was problematic. And I think Kwaku is justified in drawing the boundary and just saying, this is not positive, it's not helping, it's not even nice, and so I'm not going to get anything out of this, and leaving. And he doesn't owe them his time. His time is valuable. There's no problem with leaving. Now, does that actually help the church? I think, and help Kwaku's brand, I think it probably would be more effective for the church if somebody in Kwaku's position was able to engage a discussion like that and then deal with somebody who is impolite and aggressive and over assertive in a way that is confident, that understands those debate tactics, and then knows how to diffuse them and move the discussion forward. It's a really challenging thing to do, and a key part of that is really being cordial to your debate opponent, allowing them to finish their points and then moving on. There are some types of opponents that is hard with, and those are particularly people who just talk on and on and on and on and on, and I'm probably closer to that particular type of person. So that's where a moderator is supposed to come in and really let the discussion have a shape and a framework that progresses. And the moderator, unfortunately, was not able to really drive this discussion forward in a way that was productive, and it just ends up being a mishmash that is, I don't really feel like I understand either position better at the end of it. I do understand that it was surprising to me to hear Kwaku make some of the statements about diminishing the importance or the significance of the Joseph Smith translation. It would have been interesting to explore the implications of that. And I think on top of that, just learning how not to engage in a discussion and debate by listening to Sam in the way that he both formulated his arguments and the way that he interacted and treated Kwaku in a very kind of dismissive and paternalistic mode. So that is that. I'll let a little bit of this play. I'm going to go ahead and open up phone lines. Let me make sure that my phone system is set to the correct thing. I think we're good here. Yep. All right, that's working. If you would like to join the conversation and give us your impression of how this discussion went, you can call 210-422-2222 and give us a little bit of your impression. Let's just see a little bit while we're waiting.
Nephi. Let me now quote Ether and
Hold
show
on.
that he's not earth and all things. Like I said, he's too young. He's not ready. Anyway.
Okay, so let's see here.
Sorry.
Just left.
Okay, I want to get the moment where they realize that he left.
To teach Trinitarianism, but you can point to other passages that smack of modalism, hence the contradiction. But then this contradicts later teaching that the Father was a man who became God, slept with one of his spirit wives, and sired Jesus, because the citation gave you from the Book of Mormon,
Hey Sam.
God has been God.
Hey Sam, I just think Kwaku. I think he just left. I think he just left.
It's all right. Let him leave, bro. It's okay, bro.
Let me see.
Okay, this is where the guy is totally wrong. It's not okay that Kwaku left. I think if you are interested in having a discussion, if you offend your opponent so deeply that they leave, then you've failed to some extent to be sensitive to the things that would trigger that, and to accomplish what your goal should be, which is not to win an argument, but to increase understanding and to have an exchange of ideas that is edifying to an audience who wants to understand both perspectives, both in a positive way about what people assert about their own beliefs, as well as how they meet the challenge of criticisms and what ways they do that. And so when he says that's okay and then take a drink of water, I'm sure he feels like he won the debate. He won. The guy left like a chicken. But that's not really how these things work. If you're trying to host a discussion and you're trying to get an open exchange of ideas that allows an audience to make up their own mind, then you have not succeeded by causing one of your members to leave. Particularly when he didn't just leave without giving a warning that he wasn't going to leave. There was already an issue. Now, I think because that warning was centered around using the word cult, then maybe Sam felt like as long as he avoided that, then he was not in danger of Kwaku leaving. But I think that when you just look at the overall tone and how he treated Kwaku, I don't know that if I would have lasted much longer than Kwaku did. The debate format itself was not as structured as it perhaps could have been. Okay, if you'd like to call 210-422-2222, you can join the discussion and give us some of your impressions on this. I don't really even care what they went on to talk about after that, because once Kwaku's gone, really, I don't know. It's probably just a bunch of backslapping and high-fiving or something. I don't know. Perhaps if it's something interesting, somebody can put that in the comments. So let's see what comments we actually do have. So if we scroll up here. Okay, G-Free says, Kwaku is under massive mind control. All right, hold on, we got a call. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and stuff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Hey, so do you want me to start talking about my disagreements with the show?
Sure, yeah, please, by all means.
So the first thing that I really popped in my mind was that when we're arguing, like, we have two religions that are arguing back and forth, that it seems they have to just appeal to theological perspectives at the end. And if you're trying to have a reasoned debate, that you need to have, I'm not sure, like an atheistic perspective, but it's hard to argue against two religions pushing against each other, because they're each on immovable grounds, I guess. So that's just frustrating to watch for me when I'm watching these debates.
Yeah, no, I agree. It makes particularly when all of the arguments are around theological points that are kind of, they exist in the shelter of belief where they are accepted without evidence from the get-go. Well, then it becomes harder to use logic and reason to refute one or the other, because the very tools that we use to do that are not a part of how they were formulated in the first place. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of Mormonism, is that Mormonism does try to root itself in very concrete terms. Its whole focus on legitimate authority is so saturated throughout the entire church. I'm convinced this is why it's almost a joke and a stereotype when somebody gets up and gives a talk. The first thing that they did is they say, I was asked to talk on atonement. Well, what is atonement? Well, the Webster's Dictionary says blah, 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 blah. What they're doing there is they're engaging in this sort of appeal to authority that is inherent to the way that Mormonism views itself, and that things are not real unless there's a real authoritative legitimacy behind them. Even in General Conference, when we're quoting past general authorities, we have to define exactly what that quote was and tell you the authority that did it. So they'll say, President Howard B. Hunter said, quote, blah, 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 unquote. And so now we've identified exactly what he said and the authority that said it, because that gives it power. And so that whole framework of the existence of the church and the importance of it being rooted in legitimate authority is what makes it so compelling to people, but it also is what makes it so fragile when you actually go and look at the problems with those foundational claims of authority and legitimacy.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks so much for calling. I appreciate your podcast and everything. So thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks for calling in. Take care.
Anytime.
All right. So if you would like to share your thoughts about it, please call 210-422-2222. Jared says that a while ago, Kwaku wanted to debate Zelf on the Shelf and made a video calling him out. I don't know. Hello, this is Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
I was just thinking about the different debates between like Christians and Mormons, and just like how with the LDS view of the light of Christ being everywhere, it makes it hard where, like, if you're a Christian, you see the world as you're either in the light or you're in darkness, and the Mormon view, like, everyone has the light of Christ, and the Mormons aren't disproving anyone, they're just bringing enlightenment to everyone. And it's just, I see the challenges of, like, in the debate where it always makes the Christian look like the bad guy, because he doesn't believe that the truth is more of a subjective light of Christ and everywhere.
Well, I agree with you. I think that is a way that Mormonism can approach a debate like this and come out shining and smelling better from that perspective. The difficulty here is Kwaku did not take that approach. He really started out, his opening salvo was that if Mormonism is true, the rest of the world is wrong. And he names a bunch of religions, including the wider worldwide Christianity movement. And so he did not avail himself of that saving grace in these types of debates. And you're absolutely right. Mormonism could frame itself in that way. It is a more modern way for Mormon to frame itself. It is different from the way Joseph Smith and Brigham Young formulated Mormonism in the future, as opposed to Christianity. But he didn't do that.
Yeah, I didn't get to watch this debate, but I did watch some of the other debates. And I know that's usually where it makes it like impossible to have a conversation with a Mormon.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of those things where I haven't had the benefit of a whole lot of experience in that type of debate format, other than the extensive conversations I have with my brothers. But it'd be interesting to see I think in particular, since Kwaku has shown that he's willing to get on a live discussion and talk about controversial issues in a way that none of, even the guys who write for Fair Mormon, they're not getting out and doing what Kwaku's doing. You know, you're not going to find Michael Ash getting in a discussion like this with an actual former Mormon who's informed about these things and can talk about it. But Kwaku is willing to do this with evangelical Christians.
Well, he wasn't raised LDS, so he still has some of the more of the dogmatic views, I think, from this upbringing.
Yeah, and I think that if you want to see a little bit more of the human side of Kwaku, then definitely watching his interview in Sean McCraney's show, Heart of the Matter, where Sean takes a very hands-off approach was very more respectful of Kwaku, just saying, tell us your story. We want to know a little bit more about you. And you can connect with Kwaku's story so much better in that type of format. And I think he really expresses himself and where he finds his heart in Mormonism very well there. And you can relate to him a lot better in that regard. And I think when you're seeing your counterpart in a debate and a discussion as another human who loves their family, loves their kids, is trying their best just as you're trying your best, then it makes me I feel like you have a better connection, better discussion of ideas in that regard. This Sam Shamoun did not do that, unfortunately.
Okay.
So definitely go back, and you mentioned you haven't seen it all. Go and check and see, particularly Kwaku's opening statement, and you'll see how he frames the discussion. And it's very much a black and white, we are right, you are wrong perspective. And then he hammers home the idea that the Book of Mormon is the foundation. If it's true, then Joseph Smith is the prophet, and the whole enterprise is true. And it's a bit of a bald assertion because he's making that point, then using positive reinforcement of things that he thinks reinforces that point, but he's not really addressing the things that really are contradictory to that assertion. So,
okay, I'll definitely watch the video.
Thanks for the call.
Thank you.
Take care. So maybe there are people in this viewership who know Kwaku, and he will answer your text. If you'd like to send him a message saying, hey, they're talking about your recent debate, would you like to give your side of the story, then I would love to have him call in. We did this before with Jackson Washburn, and it ended up being a very good discussion. This is Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Hey, John. Michael, how are you?
Oh, Mike, how are you doing? I'm doing all right.
No, not bad. I was just going to say, just a quick thing. I've had discussions with Kwaku or Kwaku, whatever the heck his name is, before in the past. He's a man. He's a man child. I've seen him pick up his ball and go home numerous times. When you start out a debate about with Mormonism, and you put rules out there like you can't use words like cult. That's like saying having a debate on McDonald's health food, but you can't use the term junk food. It's ridiculous. I mean, if the shoe fits, wear it. That's like saying, let's have a debate about Osama bin Laden, but you can't use the word terrorist. It's right off the bat, he's setting rules that required Sam to not use words that are very, very applicable and apply to Joseph Smith. If he thinks Joseph Smith isn't a charlatan, and that's another word. If they say you can't use the word charlatan, it's ridiculous. To say we're going to have a debate about Mormonism, but you can't use the word cult, or I'm going to go home. What a child!
So I want to address what you said. The opening thing you said is that he's a man child, and I understand what you mean and where you get that from. And I've just kind of looked at how he's interacted on Twitter and other stuff. There was a big interaction between him and Radio Free Mormon. But I think it's important for anyone listening to him is that Kwaku is not a scholar in terms of, that's not his first role. His first role is absolutely comedian entertainer. He is comedian entertainer in the space of Mormonism, of a different flavor and different variety than Studio C, because he engages on the theology, but he is, even though he engages on theology and history, he is first and foremost comedian entertainer, and that is the space he will occupy and retreat to if he needs to, and do so legitimately, because he's not published. He doesn't put himself out as an academic anything. He puts himself out as an entertainer. So if you are going to engage with Kwaku, you just have to understand that first and foremost, you're not engaged in a debate like you would have with somebody like Michael Ash, or somebody who puts themselves as a historian or a defender of the faith. You're debating someone who is an entertainer. And so at any point, he can resort to calling you boomer or hitting you with some meme or anything that might be considered underhanded or inappropriate in an academic debate. But that is what you're engaged in with Kwaku, is an exchange that is in the mode of entertainment / comedy. And so there is entertainment and comedy that can be informative and that can involve exchanges of ideas, but that's what Kwaku does. So if you call him a man-child, that can be just kind of participating in that informal comedy / debate paradigm that he is going to engage in. But I think even though you know you're going to enter into a discussion with somebody who's a comedian / entertainer, if you want to come out feeling like you behaved as somebody who's interested in an actual discussion that's legitimate and respectful, regardless of how he behaves, you still have to be respectful, and you still have to do that. And so I think the moment that you cross the threshold and start saying that he's a man-child and that he's throwing a fit and he's doing all these things, then you've now entered into entertainment / comedian realm with him, and that's kind of where you can take it at. And this is New Name Noah. We know that a lot of the stuff that you've done in the past is in the mode of entertainment / education / comedy. And so that's kind of not surprising for you. I don't have the luxury of doing that because I've tried to make my brand mostly about informative discussion and stuff. And so I'm hopeful that that would mean he saw me as a safe person if he wanted to have a discussion about some realistic stuff. But it's almost like engaging with Jackson Washburn a little bit. You have these personalities that are out there that I think get some validation from the fact that ex-Mormons want to engage them in discussion and debate, and there's some, I can understand, like if there were a bunch of Mormons that were like, hey man, I just want to debate Streeter, I'd be like, well, I'm interested in that discussion, and I'm also flattered that people would think that I was worth having a discussion with. So I could understand that they might feel that way, but at the same time, we don't see Kwaku engaging in these types of debates with people, on my channel or anything like that. And I think it's harder for him to appeal to the ignorance of his opponent in that regard. And so I'm just talking way too much in response to your comment, but I want to make sure that we're respectful to Kwaku in terms of, if you're going to be critical of him, be critical of the things that he does that are worthy of criticism. Don't, like, the whole focus on his name and everything, I think does more disservice to people who do that. The whole focus on his race or anything like that also does a disservice. I mean, you can engage on the subject of race and how that might engage somebody who's a member of the church who happens to be black, but you have to do it in a respectful way that that still validates them as human. So anyway,
indeed. Well, thank you for your insight, John. It's always a pleasure to catch you online, and I'm a big fan of your work.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Take care. All right. Bye. Okay, so let's see here. All right. One of the things that you learn when you start to disassemble fallacious arguments and how people use things like the sharpshooter fallacy is how common those types of arguments exist in conspiracy theories. And it makes you skeptical. And so if you read the video feed for this video, you'll find comments made that include some really outrageous things. And when you go and you dig into why people believe these things, you'll find some of these same fallacies inherent to those arguments. And it's always difficult because not only do people come with those arguments, but they come with a great deal of charged emotion and a lack of objectivity into determining whether the claims that they make have enough evidence that is legitimate and believable without contradictory things to do that. And it's one of these hard things to engage in. And I always have to decide at what point do I, because I don't like censoring people. I'm okay with people sharing different ideas and perspectives, but then you have to engage in a reasonable debate and discussion about them. And as soon as you cross the line into saying that you want the blood of Mormons or something like that, I'm afraid that we just have to let that go. And it's nothing more than you need to make sure that the points and the conspiracy theory that you articulate don't cross certain thresholds. Okay. All right. If you would like to call in, the number is 210-422-2222. We are just past the 2.5 hour mark. These things always go longer than I think they should, and I don't know who's watching all this stuff, but we still have a few viewers. So if you'd like to call and share your own impressions, I wanted to finish this. I didn't know that Kwaku wanted to debate Zelf on the Shelf. Actually, I think I may have seen one of those video exchanges. I wonder what they would debate, though. I think it's a few weeks ago, before the coronavirus, I was able to host a faithful believing Mormon woman who wanted to explain how she was able to see and accept the behaviors and actions of Joseph Smith regarding polygamy without placing him in the category of a religious sexual predator. And I thought it was very fascinating. I wanted to ask her a few questions that are common criticisms of that and give her a chance to provide an explanation for it, because anyone who is able to reach that far should have answers to some very basic questions. And she did, and it was a very polite discussion. And I think even the audience member in the comments were able to do that. I reached out to her afterwards and said, you put together a logical framework of arguments. I'd like it if you can, how would you condense those into bullet points? And she sent me a document, which was the bullet points of, this is why Joseph Smith is not a sexual predator. And it's a bunch of arguments. So in a follow-up video, we're going to take those arguments and we're going to look at somebody who is not Joseph Smith that people have accused of being a religious sexual predator. And we're going to see if those arguments work to exonerate those other self-proclaimed prophets. If they would exonerate these other self-proclaimed prophets, then it presents us with a dilemma, because that would mean that those rationalizations don't have the ability to discern between false and true prophets. And it's a problem if you are willing to let that go to its natural logical conclusion. But I bring this up just to say that if you can identify a particular subject and then just give somebody a chance to lay out their reasons, then I think it can be a helpful discussion. It's been difficult for me because a lot of people in my own personal circle will try to comment on things that I have, why they have faith, and if you invite them to explain something, then you're generally met with, well, I haven't looked at that and I don't have time and I don't want to do that. So if I have a brother who's like, I still believe in Joseph Smith, I'm like, okay, that's great. But what I would like to know is, how did you reconcile the way that he obtained consent for Helen Mar Kimball to marry him in secret without his wife's knowledge by promising her family would obtain salvation after she initially refused? Like, how do you make sense of that in your mind and still believe it to be a righteous and good thing? And I mean, because that's just like that's a very critical question for people studying that part of history, because it would seem to reveal something more than honest prophet. But the response is, well, I don't really know if any of that is true. I don't know. I haven't read the sources on that. I don't know what part of that story is truth and what part of that story is exaggeration. And I don't really have time to get into it. And so I'm not going to be able to respond to you on that. And so I just have to put myself back into the time frame when I was in that position where I was really busy. I had school, I had stuff to do, I had a calling, and I just didn't have time to get into that. And it was probably just made up lies. And that's kind of how my family first started it. I think they may have been doing a little bit of reading. The last word I heard is, I was talking to my mom and I said something about Joseph Smith, and she said, yeah, I talked to one of your other brothers on that, and he said, well, if John said it, it probably did happen, but we just probably don't understand why. And it was just funny to hear that different perspective from it. It's no longer the did it happen or did it not happen. It's like, okay, well, some messy stuff happened, but it's probably all for the better. So, all right, well, we haven't had any calls in a few minutes. It's 210-422-2222. I need to get better ventilation in here. You probably can see I'm like sweating. It's really hot in this room right now. And Yu-Gi-Oh is totally asleep. He usually joins me for these coffee talks and is a butt during the whole time, but today he slept most of the time. Didn't you, little guy? So I think without any calls, we'll go ahead and close it down. Let's see, there's one comment. Do you think Kwaku is genuinely a TBM, or has his semi-fame within the church preventing himself from allowing himself to admit that it's false? That's a tough one. Hello, this is Talk on Things and Stuff.
How's it going there?
Hey, what's on your mind?
Hey, how's it going? Oh, well, I'm a fellow Christian, and yeah, I saw the debate with Forrest Down Simone and Kwaku, and even though, I mean, interesting, maybe I'm not quite sure, because interesting, I don't think Kwaku has released a video about this, I guess, about this debate yet, because usually on his channel he reviews. I know he did recently, he did a review with another debate he did, I think about a month ago with, what's his name, Aaron, I can't pronounce the last name, but
You're talking about Aaron Shapovalov.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm having a really hard time understanding your phone. There seems to be a connection issue. But do you have a question or something?
Oh, hold on. Maybe I'll call back on the better line. Hold on. Maybe I can do that.
Okay.
Is that okay? Okay. Thank you.
That's fine. All right. Okay, so that was, I don't know if you guys could understand that. It was really hard to make out what he was saying. He says he's going to call back on a better line, so we'll see how that goes. Let's see. On the question of whether Kwaku generally believes or if... Okay, so there's a BBC documentary where... Oh, well, let's take a look. All right, this is Talk on Things and Stuff.
Jonathan Streeter, can you hear me, sir?
Oh, you snuck in before the other guy called back. Yes, I can.
Oh.
How are you doing?
Oh, did I? Oh, okay. You want me to hang up?
No, that's fine. You're on the line. You're here. I don't know if he'll call back.
Oh, okay. No, yeah, I'm not trying to butt in. I'm very sad because I missed a big chunk of this at the beginning. But normally since I did miss a big chunk, I wouldn't call. But I am going to call because Kwaku, this gentleman specifically. John, I need you to help me understand something. Here's the thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, John, and we've talked about this some in the past. You're a little bit older. I'm older. We were back in the day when Bruce R. McConkie and those gentlemen, they were laying it down. It was the church materials. They had some substance to them. And over the years, they've gotten lightened up and airy-fairy and really light on substance. But back then, there was substance for you to sink your teeth into, right? Remember, Bruce? The caravan moves on. We have the truth. There's no dispute in it. So it's. I found out that I'm a black and white thinker, I guess, and which is why when I found out the truth, I left. As a matter of, I believe it took courage and integrity, and of course, my true believing Mormon friends think I'm sad and lost. But what I want you to help me understand, here's my problem, John. I just can't wrap my mind around all this nuanced stuff. It's like one thing you do, which I think is very smart because it helped me personally. You say, okay, forget Mormonism. Let's go look at the Jehovah's Witnesses and the way they're set up, and they are very like with you and the three apostates. You can see there are striking similarities between, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses and us. But when you look at them, they're trying to please Jehovah or worried about whether Jehovah's going to be sad or whatever. You go, oh, Jehovah, no. They have it all wrong, but they really believe they have it. Okay? So also, Radio Free Mormon made a really good comparison about the church, the LDS church, comparing it to the North Pole. So we all love Christmas. My mom loves watching the Hallmark Christmas movies, Christmas especially. We have great Christmas traditions. And if the church were the North Pole and Santa wasn't turned out to not really be real and there really was no real Christmas magic or whatever, what are we going to do? Well, I like the North Pole and I like the Christmas traditions. It's not true, but I'm going to somehow make it work. And I have a couple of friends who know the truth. They know it very well, but they choose to stay in the church, and they can't give me a straight answer as to why. I know that when people leave a lot of people stay in the churches because of family pressure, maybe with their spouse, maybe they're the acronym PIMO, PIMO, physically in, mentally out, whatever. But for people to say, like Kwaku, and I've heard some others, and nothing disrespectful to him, he's just a young man doing his thing, whatever, and I don't know if he's sincere or if he's trying to play to the popularity and maybe some of the notoriety he's gotten lately, because it's a name that stands out, and he's a sharp guy. He's a nice guy. I like Kwaku, but I don't like his views at all. He's out of his mind because I'm a black and white thinker. So help me pull it together, John. What, besides the pressures from family or whatever, or maybe being unsure, or maybe being on the part of the transition where you're still studying and everything, and like I did hear you say a minute ago, you when you're going to church and living your life and you're feeling your calling, you don't have time. You're supposed to read the scriptures and do all the stuff you're supposed to do. You don't really have time to really dig deep or whatever into stuff. But once you do and you learn the truth, and there's no question that this is a big sham, and I think it's important for everybody to do their own research, and it takes time, and it's very painful, and all these things. But anyway, once you do find out the truth, John, why does it need to continue? People like John DeLynn and others, they say, we want to force the church to change, which I imagine the brethren just hate them for all the pressures where they have to change. But, it's like the North Pole. Let's go back to the North Pole. There's no real Christmas magic. There's no real Santa. The North Pole structure, paradigm, whatever you want to call it, it's not really real, but there are really wonderful things to it. And anybody that's doing anything involved with Christmas is usually pleasant and wonderful, just like the people in church the everyday people like me, the rank and file, who we rub shoulders together, we serve callings together, and they are very good people. It's not the people of the church, it's the church itself. The structure of the church. Why?
I think the difference is you talked about the positive things about the Christmas narrative and the North Pole and the Santa. And that's great. That is a big part of that. Even, people who are atheists will celebrate Christmas almost like even more so just because they enjoy the lights, they enjoy the love, the laughter that you may have with your family, the tradition of giving presents. All of those things don't demand anything of you other than the positive aspects of it. We don't have people going out and feeling worthless and hopeless because of Santa, and we don't have a suicide problem because of Santa. We don't have Santa recovery groups for people trying to heal from the trauma that Santa inflicted on their lives, because they're only positive aspects of that. Now, somebody could subvert those positive aspects and turn it into something harmful. They could say, well, Santa, he's got a list, and if you're naughty or nice, that depends on whether you get presents, but let me tell you what it is that makes you naughty. And then now suddenly there's a demand and an imposition on your life, because now they're reaching into your life and shaping your decisions and your values according to what they define that list of naughty and nice to be. And if they define, if you pick your nose, you're naughty. Well, now it's like, well, my nose is a source of evil. And it's just like, it's a human thing. How can I avoid picking my nose? Well, there's all sorts of things that are part of the normal human experience that the church defines as naughty that then reach into your lives. And it can be something that's even more ethereal than that, just like, what you devote your life to. If you don't want to see your life defined by having a large family, if you're a woman giving birth to a large family and trying to emulate that Mormon 1950s nuclear family household, if you see yourself more in a much more professional mode, you don't really want to be a parent, well, you have to make that decision in the context of being told that that's a naughty decision. That Christ, if you want to achieve Christ's higher purpose, and the best role for a family is for you is to be a mother. And so it distorts people's values, and it interferes in their life in a way that is illegitimate. And that speaks again to your comment about, once you discover that the authority that the church has to define these realities for you, to these moral realities, once you discover that that authority is illegitimate, then you don't want to allow them to have any say in your life at all. You know, people who simply celebrate Christmas because of the lights and Santa and presents aren't letting that story dictate the decisions they make about the critical aspects of their life. They don't let that story determine how they will view their loved ones who choose to believe differently from them. It's just, you know, it's a fun thing that doesn't detract from their life. And I see that as a big difference between the two in terms of why do people stay in interacting with the church if they don't believe it to be true. And a big part of that is because of these relationships that we have that the church claims power over. You know, if they're able to say that, you know, if somebody leaves the church, then if a bishop advises you that since you can't get into the celestial kingdom, then maybe you need to consider divorce and marrying somebody who can take you to the temple. And then that's suddenly a choice that you're making between leaving the church and losing your family and love and relationships that you value apart from the church. And it's just an impossible decision that you can't really judge anyone who chooses to occupy that place. And I think that's the power and the reason why John DeLynn and others say that we want to try to change the church. We want to identify the harmful aspects of the church and put pressure on those things so that the church transforms into a healthier organization, and so the people who are currently forced to stay can do so in a softer and gentler way.
Okay, well, John, I'm really glad you said that, because this it really bothers me, and I'm just simply seeking to understand. The world's going to go how it's going to go, with or without me or my opinions. I get it. I'm so happy to be free. And by the way, when you are truly free from the church, there is a guilt-free freedom. Because there was a short period like when I was inactive if something happened, but the whole time I was inactive, I was like, I was still trapped in my mind in the prison of Mormon. Because I really bought it hook, line, and sinker. I really did. And I got to tell you guys, if anybody's listening and doing your research, or you're in the middle of it, the transition, it's worth it at the end. It's the guilt-free freedom, those three words, guilt-free freedom. That's what I'm so happy about. I don't know how much time I have left on earth, but by God, I'm going to be free now. So,
and it's funny is that they've demonized that very thing. You just left because you wanted to sin without guilt. Oh. And the thing is, they don't understand the reason that you don't have guilt is not because you've numbed your mind to guilt, is that you understand that doing things that are proprietary moral boundaries that Joseph Smith laid down, like coffee and tea and things that you're not hurting other people with, are not sins that merit any degree of guilt. You know, we don't feel guilt over getting a blood transfusion, but a Jehovah's Witness who believes it would feel tremendous amount of guilt over it. So it's not guilt that's the issue.
Yeah, I can't tell you what, I cannot think of anybody I've ever known from the church family who did not love their children. I mean, they love their children. That's all what it's all about, right? Me too. But they don't see how it's damaging the children. And like you were saying a minute ago with the North Pole thing, this is what I thought of, John. Santa Claus, he sees you when you're sleeping, John.
Yeah, I know.
And then I thought about Evil Apostate. I remember a line that Evil Apostate said, it's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry you had to see that, Grandma." But anyway, oh my God, the pressure put on our children is hurting the children, and that's one of the biggest things for me, because, it's just hard. But I'll tell you what, personally for me, during my transition, when it all started coming down to where the rubber meets the road, I would sit in church, and I swear to God, my eye would start twitching, because I would just like, no, this is not the truth. And so when people do know the truth, and I don't know how they can go sit in church, and because you still have to give reverence to the Mormonism story, to the current brethren, you've got to revere them. Everything comes down from on high, so you got to support you locally. It's like it's still a sham. It's still completely wrong. How can you? I don't know how you could justify it. Once that bubble has popped and you've got that freedom, it's like, the community is great, but guess what? Very, very few of my precious church family, which I love so much, even will contact me, or whatever. I saw one in the store, an older couple that I love. I gave them a hug and a handshake, and then I saw another person who I've had a lot of experience with totally ghosted me in the store. Didn't want to even see me. It's like, all right, Here, just all I can just chalk it up to Mormonism. But I'm still seeking to understand, John. I'm trying to figure out why. Once you know, how can it continue? And why will the church ever? I've heard people say the church will be around for quite a while. I'm sure it'll change. It'll be forced to change. But why should it be around? Because if you go to whatever church where they're not completely batshit crazy, like Kenneth Copeland and all those guys, you go to a church. Hey, here's a pastor. Here's an associate pastor. They're not gods. They tell you stuff.
Take it or leave it.
You could sing some hymns. You could enjoy it. They're not going to worry about whether you or your children or whatever are masturbating or worthy. Oh, what a horrible thing. Is there? Do you know why? Why does Kwaku do what he does? I mean, what in the hell is he trying to say? I don't even understand anymore. Because when people start talking, I know I jabber a lot. I'm a little off kilter and I'll jump from point to point. But when people start laying that down the stuff that starts making my head hurt, they are doing some serious double talking and spewing stuff out. It's like it doesn't even make sense to me. Yeah, I was brought up. Teach me. I would talk to my dad. My dad's a real smart guy, but I'd talk to my. He'd say, hey, just you tell all of his kids. Just explain it to me like I'm the dumbest person in the world, And so you'd have to slow it down and just keep it basic, right? So can you give me Kwaku's basic message? Can you wrap it up for me? You're very good at articulating. What is his basic message? What the hell is he trying to say?
I really don't know what his basic message is, other than whatever creative defense that we can give to maintain faith is going to fly. And most of his arguments, if you say, well, where did somebody come up with that argument? You can go, and he says, you need to go to Fair Mormon and to the Maxwell Institute. So most of the arguments that he makes are re-articulations of arguments that are made on those websites. And I think he's not alone in that. Anyone else that is engaged in apologetics right now is doing that. And they could say, well, it's no different from people saying, well, I read in the CES letter such and such and such and such. Or people saying, well, Streeter laid out this argument in a Thoughts on Things and Stuff video, and you should watch the video. It's just the same sort of thing. It's easier to take an argument that's already been thought through and use it in its appropriate context. And I think that's what they're doing. It's just one of those things where you can have an answer, but you need to be able to engage with the follow-up questions. And Bill Reel talks about this a lot in terms of there's no general authority who's willing to confront a journalist or a critic who's free to ask questions and then to ask follow-up questions. Because you can have an answer that's canned and there, but the question is how well can you engage the follow-up question about it? And so that's where, even though you and I both see some shortcomings with how Kwaku answers these things, he's at least out there engaging. Like very few other people are doing it. And for that, I'm grateful. He gives us something to look at and examine, and where no one else is. But in you, I'm a little bit scatterbrained, but even you couldn't tell me like a short breakdown, concise thing of what the heck he's trying to say. I mean, that's a general thing because it depends on the conversation. And if you just summarize it, any argument which sustains the brethren and promotes faith is an argument which he'll make. And that's it. I mean, he's not going to. What I would be interested in is somebody to say, okay, Kwaku, you've got kind of like a metaphorical approach to religion. Name something that you believe or hold close that is contradictory to what the brethren are teaching now. Something where you think they got it wrong. You say that Mormons aren't just blind obedient followers, so if you're not a blind obedient follower, tell me something that you disagree with in the church. And chances are he'll probably say, I think that they handled the policy on LGBT individuals poorly, and he may even concede that they got it wrong in terms of calling it a revelation, but it doesn't destroy his faith because the church has been wrong before on things, but that doesn't mean, God only deals with imperfect prophets. And again, it's the same argument that allows people to maintain faith.
I agree, and I tell you what, this is what somebody we talked about the other day. How a church or an organization will create a problem, and then they give you a solution. Mm-hmm. I thought about that later. I've been involved with marketing and copywriting, writing, copy and stuff. And there is a very specific formula, and it's a 3-step thing. Here it is: present the problem, state the problem, and then you say something to agitate the problem, and then you provide the calming solution, the healing balm to whatever the problem is. This could be anything. This could be a plumber could use this formula, a undertaker, a baker, a grocer, anybody, a lawyer. It's like, here's this problem, and you stir it up, and then with our service, with our product, with our whatever, here's the solution. We see it every day, but the church, our church, the LDS church, whatever, they're still doing it. And by the way, I think if you just pay attention, and I've said it before, I hope you encourage people to do the research, and that includes the stuff on your site. Remember the one you did it was Holland at the Maxwell Institute?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay. I seem to notice patterns in my old age. Evidently, I don't know, but he had a pattern. Whenever you see him, he would hit him with a little bit of a compliment or a little bit of a humor, where there was a light laugh. Then he'd hit the velvet hammer. Boom! You guys, no. Just say what's right.
Err on the side of your covenants.
Yeah, that was a masterful video, and it was so eye-opening. And I think that everybody should watch that and just decide for themselves. Is he doing some finagling here, or by the way, I got to give credit to the last podcast on the left. They did a series on Mormonism, which was hilarious. But that's where the sidestepping and bullshitting came from. I say that because that stuck with me. But that's where that came from. He was legitimately doing some sidestepping and bullshit. And then you have these faithful members in the Maxwell Institute. They're very smart. They're super smart. They're super honest. They want to do the right thing, and they're being told to shut the hell up. They're to be or lie or yeah. I mean, come on. I mean, and you broke it down very, very well. But people need to watch stuff like that. You know what I really want to see? I want to see somebody record something at a stake thing where Bednar is, which you've already done some of this, so fantastic. But I want to see Bednar revoke an apostolic blessing. That's what I know.
I keep hoping for someone to send in that recording, but I think he's caught on that people are onto him. I got to go, dude. Thanks for the call, but I have to shut things down so I can get on with life.
All right, hey, you are still a magnificent bastard. Bye.
All right, take care. All right, I know there was a caller in the wings, but I have to shut things down so I can go to work. I appreciate everyone that hung in today, and until next time, this has been Coffee Talk on Things and Stuff. Take care.